It's said that as a child, the entire world is a treasure and that life, with all of its joys and sorrows, will mold you into the person you are today. Unfortunately, for one Uzumaki Naruto, the latter was something that either didn't exist or was forbidden to him. The 6-year-old's life has been a never-ending battle as far as he can recall. His village, where he was born, had, for some reason, condemned him to a life of unadulterated hatred and perpetual fear for his safety. The beatings, taunts, and other terrible crimes committed by the shinobi and the villagers that the poor 6-year-old boy had to endure on a daily basis were never explained. Only the phrases, demon, Kyuubi brat, and the Yondaime's mistake, which made little to no sense to the boy, were used frequently in the cries of pain and rage directed at him. He recalled listening in on the matron narrating the tale of the village's Yondaime Hokage during storytime, which he was never permitted to attend. How he defeated the Kyuubi no Kitsune, the terrifying 9-tailed fox, by himself. Why so many people would mistake him for something that sounded so terrible and cruel baffled Naruto. Once more, no one would voluntarily respond to his inquiries. The Sandaime Hokage, his generous benefactor, offered justifications for the actions and treatment of Naruto. He once told him that, regrettably, they were using Naruto as a scapegoat to try and get rid of the memories of that terrible incident that occurred 6 years prior. The Hokage refused to change his position despite Naruto's pleas for him to make more sense on the matter, telling the boy that he would be able to elaborate when he was older. The Ichirakus, who ran a ramen stand that Naruto regularly visited, was one of the few people who showed him kindness. However, the reasons for the village's disdain for the boy remained unclear. Tucci and his daughter, Ayame, would frequently refer to the majority of the village's residents as idiots and fools with disgust. Ultimately, Naruto was left with more questions and no answers. Among those who questioned his treatment in the village, he wondered if his absent parents, whoever they were or are, also reflected the animosity he witnessed on a daily basis. More terrifying to him than the idea of what the people of Konohagakure would do to him as retribution for his existence was the answer to this question. To Naruto's dismay, the Hokage made an effort to reassure him that it wasn't the case, but he stopped short. Naruto was here today, and regrettably, it was just another day. In the almost midnight hour, the poor boy was pursued by 3 inebriated shinobi who were off duty, followed by 6 resentful citizens. They made it impossible to flee the village by covering every alleyway. They were going to push him out of the village's gates and into the surrounding forest, which was his only choice and one for which they would probably not be held responsible. In his state of panic, the 6-year-old was driven solely by blind desperation and had no idea what they were trying to accomplish. As the pursuit grew more intense, the desire to flee the violence, curses, and mockery promised by his pursuers made leaving the village more appealing. Regretfully, the guards at the gate have never shown concern for the boy's ongoing torture. Even though they were unbiased toward the boy, they did their duty and reported the incident to Anbu and the Hokage as soon as they noticed Naruto's fading figure retreating into the woods. Naruto had traveled the distance on his feet. As he continued to run through the trees in his state, his fear was at its height and the desire to escape overshadowed any other information that came to him, even though his senses told his mind that there was no longer any danger pursuing him. However, the ground brutally brought reality back to him as it moved away from him and descended sharply. Before long, Naruto was being thrown around like a rag doll, stumbling, tripping, somersaulting, and crashing into everything on the ground. The last thing Naruto saw before falling was a rock that protruded from the earth, giving him the happiness that darkness bestows. Naruto's eyes gradually opened a few moments later. He blinked multiple times, then winced at the agonizing pain and pounding in his head. He slowly raised his body off the chilly grass, only to discover that his movements were jerky and warped. His entire body felt as though it were in pain, and his spiky blonde hair and half of his face were warm and damp. He raised his left hand shakily and touched his face first. He then brought the hand in front of him and noticed that his blood was dripping from it. Naruto let out a dejected sigh. Suffering injuries and seeing his own blood had been a recurring theme in his life. Naruto took a few steps forward and discovered that the fall had broken his right arm, which was now hanging painfully limp at his side. Unfazed, he let out another weary sigh, this time focusing on his surroundings rather than his arm for the first time since he regained consciousness. He was at the base of a gorge where a lake was fed by a river that originated from a waterfall. Naruto stared in amazement at the waterfall's cliffside as 2 intimidating, very cool-looking figures stood in opposing positions. What separated them was the waterfall, which was also breathtaking. To Naruto's young eyes, everything was lovely. In the evening, everything was striking and aesthetically pleasing, including the stone figures, the waterfall, the river, and the lake that appeared to stretch for miles. Gritting his teeth, Naruto sat down on the grass and tried to pay attention to his arm, which instantly reminded him of its condition. It would be best for Naruto to wait for the Hokage, or Oji-san, as he affectionately called him, since he knew that they would be sending out Anbu to find him. He made the decision to pass the time by admiring the landscape, which was beautifully illuminated by the moon. "Come to me, child." Naruto's body became rigid. Out here, he believed he was alone. Someone or something was shouting. Although the voice sounded feminine, it couldn't be human due to its richness. "You need not fear. Please, come to me," Naruto swallowed. That moment, he could hear the voice clearly, and he could also hear the source of the voice. Slowly, his gaze settled on the lake, where he could make out surface ripples. Those ripples had to be caused by someone because there was no wind and no wildlife. Naruto was starting to experience a return of panic and the desire to soar. But there was also the feeling of curiosity. To his amazement, it triumphed over the other emotions, and he was soon painfully back on his feet, moving slowly while keeping his eyes fixed on the lake's surface. He stopped 5 feet from the water's edge, his eyes widening as the lake took on a luminescent glow. He was cautious, as he has always been, living in the daily tests of survival. At this point, Naruto was anxious. Where was this person and who was he? When people told him things like, "It'll be okay," or, "You have nothing to fear," he never trusted them. Too many instances of being deceived, physically and psychologically harmed, and poisoned by people in his immediate vicinity under the guise of kindness. Again, his curiosity wanted to see where this would go, but he was cautious about this stranger calling out to him. "I assure you, Naruto Uzumaki, that you won't be harmed or duped during our meeting. I am aware of the pain and betrayals in your life. I don't want to take advantage of you in order to harm you." This time, Naruto's eyes widened even more. Had this person, or whatever it was, been able to read his thoughts and feelings at that moment? His young mind couldn't comprehend anyone being able to do that. Granted, living in the shinobi world, Naruto has heard from the Hokage about many of the amazing things ninja can do, but this wasn't on the old man's itinerary of things shinobi can do. Choosing to be bold, Naruto stumbled forward another 2 feet and was only a foot from the water's edge. Here, the glowing water appeared to rise 10 feet high in the air as a geyser before some of the water fell back down, and what was left astounded Naruto. It took the shape of a woman, with long hair, a slender frame, and features he had seen on middle-aged women. Naruto's breath seemed to evaporate as he gaped at the sight before him, but he was rewarded with more when the water woman smiled and put one arm behind her while making a welcoming gesture. "Young Naruto Uzumaki, I welcome you, the brave boy whose life had been destined to carry with it a terrible burden few would be able to endure." After hearing her speech, Naruto blinked owlishly. His vocabulary was small for his age, sometimes even larger than it should be, but he heard one word that he found harder to understand than the others. "Destined." He croaked. "Yes, destined," the water maid woman said with a smile and a nod. "But since Avalon has chosen to give you a new destiny, I'm here to alter the one that was meant for you." Naruto tilted his head to the side, perplexed. "Avalon? Who is that?" "Avalon, dear boy, is not a person but a paradise that foresees all whom it chooses to be its champion. To become the greatest in their time," the woman said with a smile, amused by the child's interpretation of what she had said. She then clasped her hands together and slowly pulled them apart, causing a heavenly glow to grow in her watery palms and then seemed to envelop them as she pulled them farther apart. Naruto felt the light to be blinding, so he shielded his eyes, much to his breath caught in his throat when he turned to face the woman. The woman held a sword in her hands, a stunning and enigmatic weapon, with a sapphire blue scabbard adorned with elaborate gold patterns from top to bottom, a brilliant silver handguard that curved near the handle, a brown leather-wrapped handle, and an endpiece that was nearly diamond-shaped with a ruby in the middle. Naruto was fixated on the weapon, sheathed in its entirety. He was unsure of how long he had been staring at it, but he quickly broke out of his reverie when he heard the enigmatic woman speaking and grinning once more. "Naruto Uzumaki, I give you Escalibur. You inherited this from Avalon. In your future life as a shinobi, it will take you far and bring you victory even in the most difficult situations." She looked down at the weapon in her hands and sighed, saying, "But like the weapon itself, this gift is double-edged. It will also make people look up to you and bring respect from those who doubt your strength. Many will seek your death in order to obtain this blade for themselves." After hearing that warning, Naruto took a startled step back, but the idea that he, the demon of Konoha, would receive such a treasure was too exciting for him. Naruto Uzumaki, before Excalibur can be given to you, Avalon deems it essential that your body and soul be purified, the enigmatic woman said, closing her eyes and then slowly opening them to gaze at Naruto with a saddened seriousness. Because it won't allow something as evil and malevolent as the Kyuubi no Kitsune, even though it lives inside of you, to pervert its good intent. The watery woman's words caused Naruto's eyes to widen in confusion, shock, and fear, almost causing him to stumble backward. Did you say what? After a moment of bewilderment, the woman's eyes widened and she gave the boy a sorrowful smile. I see, she said. Therefore, Naruto, nobody has informed you of what has been placed upon or rather within you. Naruto gave a savage shake of his head. So, on the day you were born, the fourth king, or Yondaime Hokage in your language, decided to implant the soul of the beast that had terrorized the village into a newborn baby after all other attempts failed, the enigmatic woman nodded. That child, in time, would drain the Kyuubi of all of its chakra, all of its life and existence, thus saving your village. She was able to predict Naruto's next thought and emotion after observing his response to this significant revelation. However, Naruto, this does not make you the demon itself, or a demon because of it, she said, raising a placating finger. You are a special, compassionate individual. Avalon was supposed to find you and make you its newest champion as one of these. The woman took away all the doubt and worries he was about to make and instead told him what he needed to hear, and Naruto closed his mouth, which at first was about to cry out in despair at his fears becoming real, but instead she gave him a genuine smile, one of the rarest things he would ever bestow upon anyone, even those closest to him. Her words gave him more comfort than he had felt in a long time, and he was happy. With a single tear streaming from his slightly wet eyes, he muttered, "Thank you." The woman looked at the sword with a smile and a nod, her features reverting to their previous seriousness. I'll be honest. It will hurt more than you've ever felt or endured. Naruto, Excalibur must rid your body and soul of the Kyuubi before it can accept you as its new master. Will you accept this? Naruto had already made up his mind, so he was prepared for this question. How could he refuse her? She was going to purge him of the very thing that made his village's residents despise him. Even though he was putting on a brave front, the idea of suffering was a little uncomfortable, and he made an effort to maintain his brave demeanor. He said courteously, "Yes, ma'am." She laughed at his desire to win her approval. After giving a nod, she raised the blade well above her head, pointing the still-sheathed blade down at Naruto. She said, "Are you ready?" After nodding, Naruto closed his eyes tightly and prepared himself as best he could for whatever lay ahead. The sound the woman made when she threw the sword at Naruto was similar to a screeching hawk swooping down on its prey. Naruto opened his eyes in shock at the sound of the sword approaching, but they quickly widened as he saw the blade, which was now naked and glowing an indescribable color that seemed otherworldly. The scabbard soon left the weapon and landed solidly next to Naruto. But when Naruto felt the blade pierce his belly, his expression changed from amazement to shock. Naruto was unaware that there was no blood coming from the penetration. In fact, it went all the way through him, hilt and all, and buried itself in the ground behind him. But Naruto had sensed it. When he let out an ear-piercing scream, his mouth twisted into the proper shape. He made no sound, and his entire body twisted and twisted like a fish that has been left to float on dry land, resembling a puppet whose strings have been severed. After his eyes rolled back into his head, Naruto froze, twitching every few seconds until he came to a complete stop, at which point his eyelids closed. An image emerged from the red chakra mist that swirled around Naruto's abdomen. With a full set of fangs that would have once been snarling, the Kyuubi were now yowling painfully. The image and the yowl quickly vanished. However, the chakra gradually returned to the Naruto abdominal region. Naruto felt as though he had been asleep for weeks or even months when he finally woke up. He put his hands on the ground beneath him, groaning and blinking multiple times. His eyes widened as he quickly realized that he was lying on grass. He stood up and shook his head a few times, attempting to clear the cobwebs and remember how he had gotten out. Then he realized that it was nighttime because there was no light. Naruto. A pleasant woman's voice reached his ears. It sounded familiar, but it wasn't Ayame-chan. Naruto remembered everything when he turned to face the location where he had heard the voice and the identity of its owner. Finding out why his home despised him, escaping the people who were pursuing him from the village to the forest, arriving at the lake, meeting the enigmatic water lady, Anthena. Before closing his eyes, Naruto finally remembered what had happened, and his eyes grew wide. He was shocked to see his white t-shirt was spotless and free of bloodstains when he looked down at his stomach right away. As he felt around, he realized that his broken arm was also fixed. Naruto turned to face the smiling woman on the water. She appeared to be making head gestures as well. Naruto gave her a perplexed glance before turning to face what was behind him. Escalibur was the one. The scabbard was by his side, and the sword was buried 2 feet away. Naruto gulped slowly, feeling his heart in his throat. Then he slowly extended his hand and touched the sword's handle with his fingers. At that moment, a voice inside of him was encouraging him, and its spell was effective. Before long, Naruto's entire hand was tightly wrapped around the handle, and he slowly rose from the earth's confines. He was surprised to find that it was light and easy to hold in one hand. Something else happened, and his eyes grew wide. He was hearing things about the sword in his head. It filled his mind with details about the sword's history, past owners, jutsus used on it, kenjutsu katas, and other things. It seemed to work with his intelligence and mental pace and wasn't overwhelming. Naruto mouthed, "Thank you," to the sword after grinning at it when it was done. He simply thought it was right to express gratitude to whoever was assisting him, whether it was the sword or something else. He had always been courteous and appreciative of those who had assisted him. Since kindness was uncommon, he never took it for granted. In fact, he turned back to the enigmatic water-shaped woman and gave her a grateful glance as well. In response, the woman nodded and grinned. "You've done remarkably, young Naruto. Better than some who've had to go through something similar that I have seen." Then the woman appeared to be thinking as she closed her eyes. "We're almost done with each other. To return you to your village, others are en route here. As I previously stated, if anyone finds out about Escalibur, they will attack, lie, or try to persuade you to give it away so they can have it for themselves. Therefore, I advise you to keep it hidden. It would be wise, my dear boy, to wait until you are strong enough to fight these people before revealing it to the world, even though they will never be able to use it because it is now only connected to your soul." After nodding, Naruto appeared alarmed as he quickly realized what she had said. "Hold on, miss. Are you really going to leave? Don't leave me, please. I have no idea what your name is." The woman grinned and opened her eyes before seemingly gliding down from her perch atop the water geyser, which seemed to flow with her, and embracing Naruto with an unexpectedly warm embrace. "Dear, sweet Naruto, I'm afraid I don't have a name. I have simply been referred to as the Lady of the Lake, or Mistress of Avalon. Don't worry if I leave you. I will always be keeping an eye on you and will be very proud of the achievements you will undoubtedly make in the years ahead. Even though this will be our only encounter, keep in mind that Avalon and I will always be by your side, Naruto." Naruto was sobbing into her shoulder, and if he had been more perceptive, he would have realized that this woman, despite being of water, portrayed herself nude and might have been a little more weirded out. Being innocent and naïve had its moments, but he was clinging to her as if his life depended on it. He loosened his hold, though, when he felt her hand come under his chin and raised his head so he would be looking at her. He reluctantly opened his eyes and saw her beautiful face, grinning at him. "Grow strong, Naruto Uzumaki. Use Escalibur to wipe the evil away from this world and rightfully set your place in history." With one hand firmly grasping Escalibur, Naruto nodded and used the other to wipe away the tears that had become stuck. The enigmatic Mistress of Avalon nodded, grinned, and returned to the center of the water. She uttered the words, "Farewell." Her entire body erupted into a splash of water that appeared to slow as it fell lightly onto the water's surface. After wiping the last of the tears from his eyes, Naruto got to his feet. "Did you locate him? From far out into the forest, behind him," a voice spoke. Another said, "He's over there. Let's get this over quickly because the Hokage is already upset about him being driven out by the villagers." When it became apparent to Naruto that he was going to be returned to Konoha, where he was despised by all but a few, he stood stiff. He recalled the Mistress of Avalon's words as he glanced at Escalibur in his hand. Naruto approached, grabbed the scabbard, and put the weapon back in its sheath. He nodded, then said, "Toku. Hide," remembering what the sword had taught him. The blade shimmered until it was invisible, and the effects were immediate. Escalibur was then slid all the way down until the tip of the scabbard passed through his black pants and met his tailbone after Naruto opened the back of his shirt collar. But when it was invisible, it didn't reveal anything, and his clothes appeared to be exactly the same. With a sigh of relief, Naruto used the back of his hand to wipe his face. He then turned to face his reflection at the water's edge, and his eyes widened. He no longer had the whisker-like birthmarks caused by the Kyuubi inside of him. He had flawless cheeks. How was he going to account for their absence? He had serious doubts that even the Hokage would accept his, "I don't know," response. People would think the worst of him and he would end up having more problems. Naruto searched frantically for a solution to his dilemma, keeping in mind that he had a short window of time before the Anbu arrived. Soon after, he discovered it in the shape of a somewhat black earth. He had no other options, so it was only a temporary fix. He swiftly returned to the water's edge and started drawing the lines for which he was famous, along with the other things, after grabbing 3 fingers worth of dirt. Just as the 4 Anbu members entered the clearing, he concluded that it was to be expected for the time being. With an Inu mask covering his face, one said idly, "Ah, here you are. Come, we're here to take you back to the village. The villagers will think twice about harming you while we're around, and the Hokage is anxious to see you." Naruto nodded foolishly, his mind racing with so many ideas that he was hardly thinking about the here and now. He moved forward and grasped the hand of a fellow member wearing a Neko-like mask. She said kindly, "I'm glad to see you're safe, Naruto-kun." Naruto gave her a smile. When she heard that something had happened to him, she was one of the few people who showed him kindness and concern. If he was ever in the hospital, she would always go see him before the Hokage. He answered, "Thank you, Neko-san." After giving a nod, she turned to face the Anbu leader wearing an Inu mask. "Taiko, should we get going?" After Inu nodded, the 3 of Tama along with Naruto were soon making their way back to Konoha through the forest. Naruto was lying on Neko's back with one of his arms wrapped tightly but not constricting beneath her neck while Neko held his legs. Naruto touched the Escalibur hilt behind him with the other. Thank goodness it also concealed its weight. Despite the speed at which they were traveling, it stuck to him and never moved. Naruto thought, nothing's ever going to be the same. A grin appeared on his face, one that threatened to turn into the phony grin he wore all over the village, but this time it would be genuine. "I think I'll like it, though." It had been 6 years since that fateful day. Naruto Uzumaki was a different person since then. But even people he thought were close to him would never know. Since then, Naruto has started training as much as possible in secret, which was challenging because the Hokage had assigned an Anbu member to accompany him everywhere he went as a result of the villagers chasing him out of the village. He got around this by using Excalibur's Toku ability on himself. As long as he permitted it, he would always be invisible when this was in effect. He had to exercise caution, though, because he was certain that the old man himself might send more to inquire about his whereabouts if he were to miss too many ANBUs or be absent from them. As a result, the only times the Anbu saw him were when he was practicing his throwing, performing the academy's taijutsu katas, running around the village every day, or performing his calisthenics. As a result, he would start his actual training twice a week after losing the Anbu that was pursuing him. For the previous 6 years, he had been on the lookout for a number of things in addition to deceiving the Anbu. He resolved the issue of his elongated incisors and whisker-like birthmarks disappearing after mastering the Henge no Jutsu. Applying the jutsu every morning became a routine, and he grew grateful that no one was looking to see if Naruto was under any henge. He also practiced portraying someone who was completely innocent and desperate to win everyone's approval on a daily basis. He put on this front, boasting that he was the greatest ninja ever and that he would one day become Hokage. He walked around in public wearing a hideous orange jumpsuit that was practically a bullseye, and he pretended to be a ninja who was proud of his love for the horrifying hue. To ensure that no one would discover his trick, he kept his scores in the academy at a pitiful level. In actuality, it was made easier by the large number of teachers who saw him as the Kyuubi reincarnate, and their conceit and bias would cause them to either ignore him when he raised his hand or to assign him tests that only Chunins could complete. Naruto might have been offended or harmed by these teachers' actions if it weren't for that fateful night 6 years ago. But now that he was older and pursuing his goal of becoming a ninja for the village, Naruto had long since given up on the notion that everyone would accept or welcome him. His peers' perceptions of him also went as he had intended. His persistent boasting about being the best but performing poorly while attempting to turn Uchiha Sasuke, the top student in the class, into a rival painted him as even more naive and foolish. Finally, by expressing his love and admiration for the top, soon-to-be Kunoichi, Haruno Sakura solidified his reputation in the eyes of people like Nara Shikamaru, who would have caused trouble if he had been more curious or wary of Naruto's excessively loud and foolish traits. He made himself a village prankster and even went so far as to vandalize the Hokage monument early in the morning. The shinobi then led him on a fast-paced chase through the village, laughing foolishly the whole time. But one of his 2 senseis in class, Amino Iruka, presented him with an unknown variable. He used to be just another member of the "hate the boy because he's really the Kyuubi" crowd. But before Naruto knew it, the man was treating him at Ichiraku's and removing him from the academy after class. After the first week of this incident, Naruto summed it up as guilt. Naruto gradually sensed that this man was turning into one of the few people he trusted and would sacrifice his life for if their lives were in jeopardy. Somehow, the man developed some common sense, had a moment of introspection, and had seen the light. In any case, he had to maintain his false pretenses and treat this man the same as everyone else, including the Ichiraku and the Hokage, whom he trusted. For what length of time would he continue to portray the fool, the clown, the baka loser, the dobi, the Kyuubi brat? Only after he was ultimately apprehended or forced to reveal his true nature. The Genin exam was held today, and thus far, everything has been predictable. Mizuki, Iruka's assistant, who harbors a covert animosity toward Naruto, administered the right test to everyone except for him after Iruka made everyone take it. Naruto was tempted to complete the test correctly and watch the scene unfold, but he was reminded of the reasons he had put so much effort into maintaining these false pretenses about himself. He sighed and lowered his head in shame at not being able to complete the test, putting on his most terrified and frightened face. Beneath that false smile he always put on, he could hear Mizuki's whisper like sniggers at the boy's despair, though he doubted anyone else could. Naruto would have loved nothing more than to prevent the man from ever being able to properly work his job because he detested that smile. But once more, he would portray the gullible troublemaker. As the day came to an end as scheduled, Naruto made the decision to give up and purposefully fail his Bushin test in the section of the Genin exam to see how things would turn out. Mizuki was becoming increasingly irritated about Naruto's imminent failure. It was too successful, much to Naruto's dismay. In fact, Mizuki had him pegged as someone who was so desperate to obtain the first status of a shinobi of Konoha that they would steal the Forbidden Scroll from the Hokage's tower. If he wanted to stay in the academy after all of this, he would not want to be busted by the old man. Despite the fact that this is a traitor who is using a poor, stupid child, the old man might not be as forgiving as he has been on numerous occasions in the past. But it was simply too difficult to pass up one of the rare chances to truly learn from the Forbidden Scroll under the guise of innocent curiosity. The Sandaime Hokage was a secret pervert, so obtaining the scroll was simple. The only issue now was how quickly some of the shinobi from the other village would catch him before he could actually study more than one jutsu from the scroll, since he had used that weakness against him in one of the jutsu he had used to give his Fa section aide more character. It didn't take long, but before an enraged Iruka confronted Naruto, he had learned 3 things in total from the scroll. Naruto asked, his enthusiasm dripping with unbridled hope, "Wait, Iruka-sensei. I learned one of the jutsus from this scroll, so I can pass, right? Just like Mizuki-sensei said I would if I stole the scroll and then learned a jutsu from it?" Iruka, on the other hand, had wide eyes as his mind processed what Naruto had said before sensing something and charging at him, pushing him forward and away, just as Iruka, who was now where Naruto was doused with a concoction of shuriken and kunai. Iruka let out a painful grunt as he fell to the ground, and it was even more agonizing when he stumbled onto his arms and gave Naruto a desperate look. Naruto run, Mizukiya. But Naruto was frozen in place, staring at Iruka with wide eyes, genuinely shocked by what his sensei had done. His determination to maintain his character faltered, but he soon dismissed it when Mizuki emerged from the branches above, his face contorted with sick pleasure and a Fuma shuriken strapped to his back. He held out his hand and said, "Ah, Iruka, you've beat me to him. Naruto, give me the scroll." As Iruka grunted, "Don't, Naruto, Mizuki lied to you. He wanted to trick you into stealing the Forbidden Scroll for himself." Playing the innocent role once more, Naruto was horrified to see Mizuki in the branches above and Iruka's wounded form. He questioned, what do you mean, Iruka-sensei?" "Naruto," Mizuki said with a cunning smile, "do you want to know what Konoha, and everyone in it, has been keeping secret from you?" Mizuki, "No, it's forbidden," Iruka yelled at his old pal. "What?" Naruto inquired, knowing deep down what Mizuki would say, but choosing to continue his role while Iruka was present to avoid his secret being revealed too soon. With a victorious smile, Mizuki rose from the branch and pulled the Fuma shuriken from behind him. "That you, Naruto Uzumaki, are holding within you, the 9-tailed fox. The reason that all of the villagers hate you, steer their children away from you, is because you are the demon that the Yondaime Hokage failed to kill." "Naruto, don't listen to him," Iruka yelled as he stumbled to his feet. Mizuki shook his head at Iruka and teased. Iruka, why are you so adamant about protecting this thing? After all, wasn't it the Kyuubi who took away your parents from you when you were a child? We were one of a kind. You and we both loathed and hated this creature and cursed him ever since he walked into our classroom. You still feel this way, do you not? No. Iruka shook his head. It doesn't matter. Soon, I'll be regarded as a hero for taking down the Kyuubi myself and be rewarded with the Forbidden Scroll. Now, die, demon. Mizuki shrugged and threw the enormous shuriken at Naruto. However, as Iruka leapt into the path of the lethal bladed object meant for the boy, Mizuki's triumphant smirk vanished and a glare appeared. Iruka collapsed again, coughed up a mouthful of blood, and made a weak attempt to stand up again before collapsing to the ground. Since his sensei had now taken the hits for him twice, Naruto was in a similar state of bewilderment and horror. Naruto's mask came off for the first time in 6 years, revealing his true self. "Why?" inquired Naruto. Iruka was about to pass out, but he smirked and coughed up blood again before answering. Iruka then fell face forward onto the ground, losing so much blood that he entered the blissful realm of unconsciousness. Circa. Cause we are the Samaya. Naruto. Ia too looked for attention. When my parents had died too. Mask the pain of having lost them. Ia. Know that kind of loneliness too, well. Scoffing at the man's sentimental speech, Mizuki landed behind Iruka and turned back to Naruto, who, to his surprise, was now staring at him with a fierceness he had only ever seen in much older shinobi. I'll warn you this once, Mizuki. You so much as breathe on my sensei and I'll remove your head right here and now from where it stands. Mizuki was surprised by the brat's tone and the threat he conveyed, but he quickly recovered his composure by grinning. So, demon, you're finally showing your true colors. However, with all your training at the academy, I know just how empty your little thread is. Naruto reached to his back and grinned. You do you? Well, bastard, get ready for a surprise you won't live to tell about. Moseru, reveal? Mizuki raised an eyebrow at the words, but as soon as he saw the boy's appearance drastically change, both of his brows were raised and his eyes widened. The short boy in the hideous orange jumpsuit had vanished. A preteen who was roughly 2 inches shorter than him now stood in his place. The boy was dressed in a green leather short coat with a hood and a white, form-fitting tunic over a metal mesh shield. His black cargo pants were encircled by numerous senbon, kunai, shuriken, and throwing knives of various kinds, and he wore metal-plated gloves. The boy had 2 kukiras, or curved knives, strapped to a black leather belt, making him a formidable weapon. But Mizuki was most surprised by 2 things. First, the boy's whisker-like birthmarks, a mark left by Kyuubi, were missing from his now slender face. The other was a sophisticated sheathed sword that was tied from Naruto's shoulder to his left hip and strapped to his back using a brown cloth that appeared to emit a divine glow. Even though there was no light in the evening, the boy's sapphire eyes seemed to shimmer when he opened them. The boy shook his head and scowled after initially reaching for the sword on his back. Naruto moved his hand from the sword's hilt to the handles of the kukiras on his sides and said, more to himself, no, I don't want to tarnish Escalibur with your traitorous blood, Mizuki Teme. No, I think Byakuya and Tasuki will suit your execution better. With a frown on his face, Mizuki pulled out a kunai and prepared himself for whatever might come next. This was undoubtedly not the same brat who repeatedly failed in class. No, that boy was a stranger in his own skin. Is the Kyuubi employing a ruse? If this is the case, when did the Demona known for its animalistic ferocity wanna use weapons to wreak havoc and devastation? Mizuki didn't know how to respond, and he didn't like his current circumstances. When his true appearance was revealed, Naruto could see the reaction he was receiving. He enjoyed it, and the thought of transforming this jerk into something more worthy of his reputation appealed to him even more. He expertly twirled the blades in his hands after pulling them out. Escalibur was his first favorite weapon, and these were his second. He recalled how he had meticulously revived them after discovering them severely damaged in a scrap pile outside a weapons store. They would now be used against the traitor in front of him. Don't act so surprised, Mizuki. After all, you of all people should know that appearances can be deceiving, especially from the beginning. Naruto closed his eyes and then snapped them open, his blue sapphire eyes glowing more brilliantly. Now, prepare yourself. Naruto then vanished from Mizuki's view before reappearing directly in front of him. He then severed the man's right arm, followed by his left leg, and then, in the same swift procession, slammed the man's jaw, sending Mizuki flying back. It had all happened so quickly that Mizuki was sent spiraling into darkness without even having time to scream in agony after having 2 of his limbs amputated. Naruto stood over Mizuki's bloody body, expressionless. He took a step closer, but stopped when he heard Iruka nearby groan. His eyes were hard and cold. He closed his eyes and considered the pros and cons of leaving Mizuki alone or killing him as he had promised. He chose the latter because he was aware that killing a shinobi, traitor or not, would probably spell his downfall. He knew that Anbu would be arriving shortly to take the scroll and himself, so he decided to put the Kukiris away. If he wanted to escape this situation as an innocent, if dim-witted, party, he should get back into his role and wake Iruka. Prior to that, though, he needed to make sure Mizuki was telling the truth to the interrogators, who would probably try to extract the story from the disarmed and limped man. Naruto approached, dropped to his knees, removed Escalibur from its sheath, held it over Mizuki by the handle and blade, and uttered a few words before the blade turned the same shade of blue as his eyes. After it quickly faded, Naruto nodded, re-sheathed Escalibur, and got to his feet. He swiftly reformed the henge to return to his character's form after hearing Anbu approaching. After Naruto removed all of the remaining weapons from Iruka's front and back and applied the best bandages possible, Iruka came to. He had made 2 tourniquets for Mizuki's arm and leg, but he had done so reluctantly. In response to learning of Mizuki's condition, Iruka gazed at Naruto in astonishment and a hint of caution. However, he chose not to discuss what had happened when the boy had passed out at this time because he was aware of how vulnerable the boy might already be as a result of having such a bomb dropped on him by Mizuki, which revealed the reason behind the villagers' and other teachers' treatment of him. He heard Naruto cautiously ask, "Are you all right, Iruka-sensei?" Iruka glanced at the boy, recalling that he was still worried despite having heard everything Mizuki had said, including Iruka's previous attitude toward him. Iruka was incredibly proud. Iruka was beaming. "Close your eyes, Naruto. There's something I want to give to you." The Sandaime Hokage, Sarutobi Hiruzen, observed from his crystal sphere as Iruka gave Naruto his own Hite aid and congratulated him on his passing. The boy immediately responded by glomping the teacher and shouting with joy that he had passed, but the Hokage didn't share the same joy the two were displaying because he was disturbed by what had happened earlier, Naruto's now clearly phony appearance, and the beautiful sword he appeared to be carrying, which was now held invisibly to his back. The Hokage was determined to learn everything there was to know about the boy he believed he knew by the end of the day. Sarutobi Hiruzen, Sandaime Hokage of Konoha, ordered Iruka and Naruto to come and report on the incident after the Forbidden Scroll and the disfigured Mizuki were recovered. During this period, Iruka swore on his honor as a shinobi that Naruto was tricked into stealing the scroll after proudly and protectively discussing the incident in which Naruto had defeated a person of higher rank and abilities. Sarutobi absorbed all of this, but he never took his eyes off Naruto, who was blushing at Iruka's compliment and shifting uneasily in his seat. However, the Hokage questioned the boy's sincerity because what he saw on his crystal sphere indicated that the boy had been hiding a lot from everyone, including himself. After assuring Iruka that Naruto was not in any danger and that he needed to speak with the boy privately, Sarutobi thanked him for his report and asked him to go. He turned to face Naruto after Iruka had left, sighed, and pulled out his pipe. "Naruto. What would you say if I told you I saw everything of what happened in the past several hours from this room?" he asked, observing the boy's response. Naruto's response was dramatic. His mask fell off, and he sighed as he straightened from his hunched position to one that was more erect and focused. "Oji-san, before we continue, could you please tell the Anbu here to leave us alone?" Sarutobi grinned upon hearing his loving moniker, which he used honestly, demonstrating to Naruto that their relationship was genuine and not something he had invented or exploited for personal gain. Sarutobi nodded and gestured with his hand, and before long, there were loud whooshes as people who had not been in the room departed. Following more hand signals from the Hokage, an imperceptible barrier was soon in place. "I also placed a protection barrier, applied with a soundproof one. No one will know of this conversation, Naruto." After giving a nod, Naruto got up and turned his back on the Hokage. "One thing you should know, Oji-san. I've only acted the way I have to make sure no one was going to come after me or question my behavior enough that people might think that the Kyuubi was influencing me. I'm sorry that I had to portray the person I've been living to the ones I trust and love the most, but I had to make sure my secret would be safe." Sarutobi was concerned about what might happen with this secret the boy was discussing, even though he was shocked by the tone and speech the boy was using in contrast to the happy-go-lucky boy he knew and proud of how honest he was being that he didn't like lying to those he cared about. He inquired, "What secret is it exactly?" With a sigh, Naruto turned to face the Hokage. He described to him how the shinobi and the villagers drove him from the village 6 years prior. He continued by telling him about his encounter with the enigmatic mistress of Avalon, who revealed to him that Avalon had selected him as its champion and that he possessed the Kyuubi. Sarutobi was amazed by the story, but he was also a little suspicious of who this mistress was and why she was helping Naruto in disclosing a secret that the boy shouldn't have known until he was old enough to handle it. But regardless of how last night's events turned out, Mizuki would have ruined it. As Naruto continued talking about the sword Escalibur that Sarutobi had seen, he listened. She then told me, before Avalon could claim me as its champion, that my body and soul needed to be purified, as it was tainted by a sinister, evil, and vindictive being. Sarutobi's pipe dropped from his mouth as his eyes grew wide. Are you saying a? Naruto grinned and removed the henge from himself, and shortly after, his whole body underwent a significant transformation similar to what Sarutobi had witnessed from his sphere hours before. It was completely different to see the real thing in front of his eyes. With a lean, baby fat-free face and no whiskers at all, the boy now resembled the younger fourth Hokage. With reverence, Naruto pulled Escalibur from his back and gazed at it. To emphasize his statement, Naruto first resheathed Escalibur before lifting up the bottom of his tunic and the wire mesh shirt underneath, revealing his perfectly bare, partially toned stomach. She threw this blade right through me and it claimed the Kyuubi's life as well as healed my injuries from before. After directing some chakra into his hand, he touched his stomach to reveal that the seal that had been on him had vanished. Sarutobi took a few erratic breaths and swallowed as he processed what Naruto had said. At last, the Kyuubi had vanished. It would no longer be a continual danger to the village or Naruto. Sarutobi initially found it hard to comprehend why the boy would want to conceal the fact that he no longer harbored the beast within him, but who would believe him if not the Hokage? Because the past had broken so many people in the village and blaming the boy was, regrettably, the only way they could move on, there would be countless people who would question the situation and others who would adamantly deny the truth. From a political perspective, Naruto would be better off continuing to act as though he still had it. Massive invasions from places like Kumo or Iwa could threaten Konoha if word spread to their neighboring villages that they no longer had the strongest Biju available to them. No, despite their mutual desire, Naruto was safer playing the Jinchuriki because there were too many barriers preventing the truth from being revealed. Sarutobi glanced at the weapon on Naruto's back before turning back to face him as he put his clothes back down. Can I see it? Naruto's attitude changed as he glanced up at the Hokage. He was serious now, but he sighed and closed his eyes. She also said that there were going to be many to try to take this sword for themselves and most likely kill me for it. That's why I've had it hidden amongst other things about myself. No one would suspect of the village's Nave troublemaker of possessing such a weapon. The Hokage was extremely proud of the boy for setting such a lofty objective for himself. He was correct because people would have undoubtedly attempted to steal the weapon from him if they had learned that he possessed it. Despite the law, those who hated him the most would have made more attempts to murder him than they had in the past. In order to survive and demonstrate that he was deserving of being a shinobi, this boy has concealed his actual potential, intelligence, and skill for a full 6 years. Inside the Hokage's heart, pride was now battling guilt. If I let you hold it, would you give it back to me? Naruto asked, carefully pulling out the sword once more and glancing at the Hokage. Sarutobi recognized the question beneath it right away. Would you betray me as so many have before? Subconsciously, Naruto asked everyone he encountered this question. Mizuki confirmed his suspicions last night, and now he was using it to test whether the Hokage, his Oji-san, was still the man he had grown to love and respect. After letting out a sigh, Sarutobi grinned. I will. You've proven last night that you can use it and it seems it's your birthright. I promise I won't betray your trust, Naruto. With a rare, sincere smile, Naruto pulled the sword from behind him once more and extended it slowly toward the Hokage. With a nod, Sarutobi reached for the blade and took it, but he did not fully grasp it. Instead, he kept it at a distance from Naruto's hands. He balanced in his hands and said, Although it was light, the edges suggested that it was lethal. The blade's surfaces featured exquisite carvings and designs that were unmatched in beauty. The guard and handle were strange. The handle of the guard was wrapped in brown leather that matched the leather strap of the sheath, and the guard's stems were curved. This was a beautiful and lethal weapon, and now it was in the hands of the boy in front of him. Based on their conversation and his personal knowledge of the boy's ancestry, he could tell that it would be wrong in the hands of someone else. For better or worse, this belonged to the boy. Naruto nodded appreciatively to the Hokage after Sarutobi returned Escalibur to him. Then Sarutobi returned to his desk and sat there, interlocking his fingers. With a completely different viewpoint, he stared at the young man in front of him. His other option, Kakashi Hatake, and the two genin were chosen based on the lie Naruto had made about his image to prevent others from discovering the truth about him, so he had to make a smart decision now for the sensei to teach the boy. Kakashi would still be a great choice, but in the long run, it would be detrimental to the boy because the council wanted him to teach Uchiha Sasuke, the last loyal Uchiha, so he couldn't focus on his other two pupils. Regardless of who he was with, Naruto would probably continue this charade, which would make Kakashi even less inclined to train the boy, regardless of why he wanted the boy on his team if he had passed the tests. Well, even though he probably wouldn't be aware of their relationship, Naruto was on good terms with his fiancée copyright, which was the best part of the alternative. Since both are skilled in kenjutsu, they would make excellent instructors for the boy. But would they? To Sarutobi's dismay, one was a Chunin and the other was an Anbu member. Both loved their jobs and showed no desire to leave them or advance. However, Naruto was turning into a fascinating mystery. Without saying or doing anything, he might be able to sue them. An Anbu wearing a Neko mask materialized after Sarutobi made a hand signal. She saluted and said, "What can I do for you, Hokage-sama?" "Neko-san, can you please bring in Hayate-san in? I wish to speak to the both of you." The Hokage gave the order. After giving a nod, she vanished into a cloud of smoke. Naruto glanced at the Hokage, perplexed as to why Neko-san was bringing someone over. Oji-san. Am I still needed here?" The Hokage nodded. "Yes, Naruto. I've just sent her to get someone who'll be one of your two senseis." Naruto's eyes grew wide and a smile appeared on his face, but it gradually faded and he was about to make the henge hand sign when the Hokage raised his hand. "You don't have to worry about appearances, Naruto. You have a supporter in Neko-san and Hayate Gecko. They've both expressed that they've thought nothing but the best about you. Trust me, they will not betray your trust." Naruto grumbled, "You said the same thing about the faculty at the academy. Mizuki changed that." With a sigh, Sarutobi said, "I was wrong then, Naruto. I promise you, it's different here." Uncomfortably, Naruto nodded and sat down in one of the two chairs in front of the Hokage's desk. Two clouds of smoke soon filled the room, and two figures emerged. Neko-san, and a medium-height man with his hatae covering his head like a bandana. He had dark circles under his eyes and was pale. He gave the Hokage a salute while coughing. "How may I be of service, Hokage-sama?" Sarutobi nodded. "Hayate-san, you are hereby promoted to Junin, effective immediately. In addition, you are to be given a pupil who'll train under you and Neko-san. Neko-san, you may remove your mask as you'll be reassigned as a Junin sensei as well." Neko-san took off her cowl and mask to reveal a stunning woman with warm almond eyes and shoulder-length light purple hair. She bowed, grinning. "Shall I go by my name or are you going to designate me one?" she inquired. He nodded and said, "You may go by your original, if you like, Azuki Yugo-san." While Hayate was examining the young boy with his back to them, Yugo nodded. His blonde hair made it clear who he might be, but Hayate wanted to be sure. He inquired, "Is this to be our student?" The boy got up from his seat and turned to face them after the Hokage nodded. When Hayate and Yugo first saw the boy, they were both stunned, but this was short-lived. Hayate started, "Why you look like," but Sarutobi stopped him with a raised hand. The Hokage said, "This is Naruto Uzumaki, your new student, believe it or not." "Naruto-kun?" exclaimed Yugo. Her eyes were so unbelievable to her. The young man in front of her had nothing in common with the hyperactive, orange-clad young person she had known and kept an eye on. This person was completely different. In addition to having what seemed like an infinite number of weapons on his legs and sides, he was dressed to kill, and that sword on his back gave him an unearthly appearance. She turned to look at her fiancé copyright and saw that he was both impressed and shocked by the boy's appearance. He inquired, "Where's your whisker marks?" Yugo glanced and was shocked that she had overlooked that information while examining him. The boy no longer had birthmarks. His face was starting to look more mature than that of his peers, and so was his baby fat. The entire time, Naruto was staring sheepishly at the ground, waiting for the worst to happen, when they would start asking the Hokage questions about the Kyuubi. When they didn't, his optimism soared, and by the time Hayate asked his question, he thought it might be okay to share his story. He spoke to Yugo Ne, who he understood to be Neko-san. "Ne-chan, I have something to tell you that you need to hear." She nodded, and she and Hayate took a seat while Naruto told them both what had happened before she had discovered him 6 years ago in the Valley of the End. He continued by outlining his decisions and his self-deception to trick people into thinking what they had always assumed about him, lest they grow suspicious and believe the Kyuubi was in charge or had escaped, at which point they would blame him. By the time he was done, Yugo was spellbound and unable to speak. In front of her, Naruto had transformed into one of the most promising shinobis to have ever left the village. He didn't want to take any chances, so she was a little offended by the length of his charade and his inclusion of her. She was able to forgive him, though, because she recognized that Anbu members had a strong need to keep things private, even from those who were close to them. Yugo got up and approached the boy, then leaned slightly to give him a cozy embrace. I understand, Naruto-kun. I promise that I'll neither steal that beautiful sword from you or betray the trust you've given to me so tenderly. This I promise on my life. As soon as he returned the hug, Naruto started crying and cried a little into her shoulder. As he observed the events, Hayate grinned. He was always aware of Yugo's affection for Naruto. They would have adopted Naruto if it weren't for his frequent need to travel for medical treatment and her Anbu responsibilities. His teachers might have to settle for the second best. Hayate had a good eye for people who practiced kenjutsu and weapons extensively. He could tell the boy was serious about his training and career because of the callousness of his hands and the early developmental signs in his arms. But before they started this apprenticeship, he needed to know a few things. Naruto, I assure you I share Yugo-chan's sentiments and will never betray your trust nor steal that which is precious to you. Naruto nodded and gave a sincere smile. Standing, Hayate coughed a little before catching his breath. Before I begin your instruction, I need to understand, from yourself, both your strengths and your weaknesses, as you perceive them. We'll have a spar tomorrow for me to grasp everything else, but I'd like to hear from your own mouth an evaluation of your skills. Yugo shifted to sit next to her fiancé copyright as she waited to hear Naruto's words after Naruto nodded and released her. Well, said Naruto, I know over 25 jutsus related to my sword, Escalibur, that are used either through it or in conjecture with it. For example, I can hide myself in it, or I can heal myself or others with it as well. This statement caused all three of the other people in the room to widen their eyes. The Hokage questioned, how good of a concealment? Anbu has yet to find me when I'm really training, Naruto said with a cheeky smile. No offense, Yugo-ne. With a smile, Yugo said, none taken, Naruto-kun. Even though he was impressed by the last revelation, Hayate was curious to find out more about the boy. Is that all? He asked, knowing that wasn't it. Naruto nodded. I'm proficient in all my weapons, including the Kukiris I have. I can proudly say that I could hit the dead center of the eye of the Nidaime on the Hokage monument from here with any of the throwing tools I have. Yugo grinned, Hayate whistled, and Sarutobi coughed at Naruto's rude statement in front of the Hokage, especially one who was widely known to have been the Nidaime's pupil. Naruto went on, however, it ends there, unfortunately. My taijutsu is abysmal as a ninja but average for a street brawler. My genjutsu is non-existent and my judas only go as far as what we were taught at the academy. The 3 I learned from the Forbidden Scroll, and the ones that apply only to Escalibur. When the Hokage heard the second to last thing Naruto had said, he gasped. You learned 3 from the Forbidden Scroll. After hearing that, Yugo and Hayate were also alarmed, and Naruto stepped back and sheepishly scratched the back of his head. He laughed nervously, forgot to tell you that, huh? Hey hey huh. Naruto. The Hokage cautiously and slowly inquired, which 3 did you learn from that scroll? Naruto answered, Kage Bushina Dai Kage Bushina and Hakai no Kage Haro. There was silence in the room. After a few minutes of silence, the Hokage cautiously asked again. And how proficient are you in those 3? Since the last 18 Kage Bushins that I sent out to perform them. Pretty good, I guess. Though I might add, Training Ground 5 will need to be replaced, though. Naruto grinned. With a sigh, Hayate said, well, now I have a rough estimate on what we might need to work on. He put his hand to his chin and started to think, going silent except for a rough cough. Before long, he stopped and turned to face the Hokage. Hokage-sama, with your permission, I have a rather unusual request. Sarutobi turned to Hayate while still staring at Naruto, something he hasn't done since Naruto dared to paint the faces of the Hokage monument in obscene symbols. Yes. Yugo followed Hayate as she got to her feet. I'd like for Naruto to be paired up with a joint sensei who already has a team and for a member on that team to be jointly used as a sparring partner and part-time teammate, whenever time allows. He'd be able to help in one of Naruto's shortcomings while his student would help as both she and Naruto specialize in a particular area. Who? The Hokage asked, raising an eyebrow. Maeda Guy and Tenten Shinomori. At that moment, Yugo and the Hokage both turned pale, and Naruto turned to face them with curiosity. Who are they? Undercover, Naruto accompanied Hayate and Yugo to Training Area 13. Yugo reluctantly whispered something to Hayate, who merely shook his head. Naruto was stunned when they arrived at the location. A tall, powerful man with the strangest hairstyle and shaggy eyebrows was yelling at his three pupils. One of his pupils appeared to be a younger version of the man. He was striking a training post at breakneck speed while wearing a fierce, determined expression. Another boy with white eyes was striking at a similar post, but his strikes were so precise that they were lethal to anyone they came into contact with. Last but not least, a girl with twin buns on top of her head was launched repeatedly from a variety of weapons while high in the air. As he observed her and became enthralled with her precision and dexterity, Naruto's eyes appeared to be glassy. But when he heard his senseis summon their sensei, Maeda Guy, he jolted out of it. In an instant, the man was gone, his teeth gleaming in the sunlight. Hayate. You've made Junin. Congratulations. We need to celebrate later, you too, Yugo-san. Now, how may I help you? He called out to them. With a series of coughs, Hayate reached into his pocket and pulled out the handwritten instructions the Hokage had made before they arrived. He handed it to Guy, who raised one of his enormous eyebrows before accepting it and placing a hand on his chin while reading it. When he was done, he gave Naruto a look. Is this statement about the boy accurate? Asked Guy. Naruto, may I? Hayate asked, turning to face Naruto. After glancing at his sensei, Naruto turned to face Guy. First, a question, Guy-san, with a promise of no punishment whatsoever by the Hokage. How do you feel about me? Guy was taken aback, but his astonishment gave way to comprehension. I feel like you are a human boy with a magnificent flame of youth, burning inside you. You are nothing of the Kyuubi, no matter what gossip comes around these days. Does that settle your worries? After giving a nod, Naruto turned to face Hayate and gave another nod. Then, leaning forward, Hayate whispered in Guy's ear. Guy's response was amusing, to put it mildly, as his jaw slackened and his eyebrows appeared to have vanished into his hair. What? His students became aware of his outburst, halted their activities, and joined their sensei in support. While one appeared bored and uninterested, the other two were genuinely interested in what the outburst was about. Guy instantly became calm, but he continued to gaze at Naruto with astonishment and awe. He turned back to Hayate and said, well, that's surprising. I'll allow this under the condition that I'll be there for their sparring matches and that another student of mine be with them on missions. He looked at Naruto and gave him a thumbs up. Don't worry, Naruto-kun. Lee's flames of youth shines almost as brightly as yours, so you don't need to worry about him. With pride on his face, Rock Lee, the boy mentioned in Guy's nearly mini-clone, gave his sensei a thumbs up while crying. Tenten! Yelled Guy. Wondering what her sensei wanted of her, the girl with the two buns on her head sighed and stepped forward. She just wanted to be at peace and return to training. She glanced over the guests as she approached. One was a sickly-looking man with big, dark circles under his eyes. The other was a lovely, smiling woman with a "make me mad, I slit your throat" vibe. Last but not least, there was a boy about her age whose bright orange jumpsuit, blonde hair, and whisker-like marks on his cheeks made an impression on her that she was unable to remember. She soon found herself beside her sensei, to whom she raised her gaze expectantly. Guy put his hand on her shoulder, gave her a sly smile, and turned to face the three people on the other side. Tenten, from now on, you're going to be sparring with young Naruto here and, when time permits, will partake missions with him and Lee. Tenten turned to face Naruto, who gave her a sheepish smile and a wave before turning back to her sensei with a disbelieving expression. What's the punchline, sensei? Cause, I don't get it. A frown replaced Guy's smirk. This is no joke, Tenten. It's also an order from the Hokage himself. Hayate breathed a sigh of relief. Shinomori-san, he's telling the truth. I know Naruto doesn't look like much, but as you should know, deception is a ninja's greatest ally. Tenten did a double take as he turned to face Naruto, who was now staring in a different direction and appeared to have clouded his eyes. Here, something wasn't quite right. She could tell the boy was concealing something right now. She was merely curious and had no interest in sparring or teaming up with the boy to pick up the pace when he faltered. She replied, whatever. I'll do it, if it's an order from the Hokage. Good, Yugo uttered for the first time. Tomorrow, if you have no prior arrangements with your team. You'll start off a sparring with Naruto first thing in the morning. We'll send both you, your sensei, and Lee-kun over there information on where to come. Lee shall be present as he'll be a member of this unit. Do you two understand? She turned to Tenten and Lee. For some reason, she found it annoying that Tenten had dismissed Naruto when they had first arrived. Yugo was going to take pride in the fact that she would lose most of her confidence when Naruto first extends his hand to this arrogant little kunoichi. Lee and Tenten both nodded. After everything was said and done, the parties parted ways. Everyone would undoubtedly be surprised tomorrow. She wasn't surprised that the message had arrived earlier than she had anticipated. What was the location of their scheduled meeting? Tenten never would have imagined that there would ever be a designated location outside of the village. It was an amazing sight to witness the historical site known as the Valley of the End, where the Shoden and Madara Uchiha squared off for the title of village ruler. The two men's enormous figures were positioned between a waterfall that fell 5 stories below into a river that extended into a lake. Along with Guy and Lee, Tenten waited for Naruto and his 2 senseis to arrive at the lake's edge. Tenten's attitude from yesterday hasn't really changed. She continued to believe that this was a waste of her time because she could be training instead of evaluating the abilities of another boy for his sensei or senseis, in this case. The only thing preventing her from outright declining yesterday was curiosity. Why did the Hokage order her, of all people, to spar with this boy? She vaguely recalled Naruto from her time with Lee and Neji at the academy. He was awkward and clumsy, she recalled. Neji was frequently reprimanded or made fun of by the teachers and other pupils. Tenten, however, showed no interest in a boy who struggled to throw a kunai because she was more focused on demonstrating her own abilities. She acknowledges that her behavior was unjust, but it was the way things were. She repeatedly raised her eyebrows after learning more details about the boy from the gossip grapevine. Many of the village's residents treated the orphan with some degree of disdain, and none of them were prepared to express their disapproval further. Once more, it wasn't her issue. Why was he fighting her in spite of everything? He consistently caused trouble, finished last in his class, and appeared to dress to be killed. Was it all a joke? Guy's sensei disagreed, telling her that this sparring match would have taught them both a valuable lesson in the end. Thus, she sat on a rock, spinning her kunai, growing increasingly irritated as the minutes passed and Guy and Lee declared their youth. The abrupt splash on the lake behind her distracted her, and when she looked back, she saw that the others had come. However, she was shocked to discover that Naruto was one of the 3 of them standing atop the water. Before starting to cough, Hayate said, "Sorry we're late, my appointment went longer than I thought it would." To her, he was yet another mystery. She couldn't understand why someone so ill would be a shinobi on active duty. Guy exclaimed, "Nothing to fret, my youthful comrades," while performing a handstand one-armed push-up. After landing on his feet after performing a mid-air flip, he grinned broadly and gave a thumbs up. "Shall we get started, then?" "Are you ready, Naruto-kun?" Yugo asked, turning to face Naruto. "Hi." Naruto nodded before moving away from the lake and into the center of the clearing. He turned and bowed as he glanced back at it, then turned back to Tenten, who had positioned herself and was staring at him strangely. She questioned, "Why were you bowing to the lake?" Naruto closed his eyes and said, "Something personal." When he opened them, he gave her a look of intensity she had never seen in a boy. He said out loud, "Remember, nothing leaves here about myself, am I clear?" Tenten stared at him strangely motionless as Guy and Lee nodded. He asked again, his gaze piercing hers. "Am I clear?" Tenten nodded, sighed, and returned to her stance. After giving a nod and making a hand gesture, Naruto's appearance abruptly changed. Tenten watched Naruto transform, and her eyes grew wide. He grew taller, and the orange jumpsuit had been replaced with a white tunic shirt over a wire mesh one. A green leather jacket with a hoodie covered both. Fingerless gloves with steel plates on the back were placed over Naruto's hands. He had on black cargo pants with numerous senbons and other small throwing weapons strapped to his left leg. There were 2 immaculate kukiras at his waist and 3 rows of kunais on his right leg. The sword on Naruto's back, however, drew her attention. Its handguard had a distinctive curve, its handle was wrapped in brown leather that matched the strap that ran diagonally across Naruto, and it had a sapphire in the middle at the end. It was stunning, and Tenten wondered how the boy had acquired such an amazing weapon. She was even more shocked to see that his face had become thinner and more defined, and that the whiskers had disappeared. When he opened his eyes, his entire appearance screamed that of a seasoned shinobi, with his hitae tied around his forehead. The transformation was too dramatic for Tenten to believe that it was either genjutsu or an elaborate henge. To put Naruto to the test, she chose to strike first. Tenten pulled out two sei and spun them around in her hands while running quickly ahead. Naruto took off his kukiras and followed in her footsteps. Tenten quickly formed the sign with chakra focused on it and shouted, "Kai," to dispel any genjutsu as soon as they met. None existed. She came to the conclusion that, to the best of her knowledge, Naruto actually looked like this, and it's possible that his entire arsenal was real. She was perplexed by this, but she made the decision to ignore all of her worries and concentrate on the game. To her surprise, Naruto batted away the barrage of attacks she launched at him. With her hands firmly planted on the ground, she executed a backwards flip, causing Naruto to stumble back as the tip of her foot struck his chin. But he recovered quickly, rushed forward with a leg sweep, and caused Tenten to fall backward. She leapt back up and hurried to intercept Naruto while catching herself on one hand and hurling her sai at him with the other. As the sai flew past him, Naruto quickly dodged beneath it and came to a one-footed stop. Then, with his kukiras outstretched, he brought his body forward, supported himself on that foot, and started rotating his body at an amazing speed. Tenten had to stop herself, slipping as she did so, and raised her last sai to block Naruto's kukiras's blows. But she was pushed back even further by his momentum, demonstrating his strength superiority. He halted abruptly, then dropped both of his kukiras to the ground before getting down on one knee and starting to throw knives and draw his senbon. He started hurling them quickly in Tenten's direction, but she quickly sought cover before pulling a scroll from her side and biting her thumb. She wiped her blood on the scroll and leapt into the air as hundreds or even thousands of throwing and handheld weapons appeared on it. She could see that Naruto had paused his barrage of weaponry below her and appeared to give her a brief glance. Then, with a big smile on her face, Tenten unleashed her horde of weapons at Naruto. With confidence, she thought, if Naruto had Neji's Kaden, he'd be able to deflect this. Since he doesn't, this fight is all over. Conversely, Naruto grinned. A smile appeared on his face as he said, "Now would be a good time to use that jutsu." Hayate's eyes widened and he started yelling, as though he could read his student's mind. "Naruto, don't, if you use too much chakra, it'll kill her." Guy, who was observing alongside Lee, arched an eyebrow in response to Hayate's statement, but his curiosity and confidence in his student's abilities kept him from alerting her to something. As Tenten's weapons approached, Naruto made a circle in the ground around himself and then made a series of hand signals. "Hakai no Kei's Haro," he shouted as he stopped at the final one, just as the few dozen of her weapons were almost 5 feet away from him. Tenten's weapons and herself appeared to be in the path of a violent updraft of wind that erupted from the circle Naruto had created. The weapons were apprehended and thrown off in various places. Tenten struggled with her arms as they flailed around due to her weapons becoming entangled in the violent gusts. She had held onto the weapons by an invisible string that was connected to her chakra. Since the attack was coming at her quickly, she decided it would be best to cut and flee, so she stopped using her jutsu and dove to the ground. Her attempt was only partially successful because her body was thrown backwards right away after her legs became entangled in the torrent. She was caught in an excruciating and blinding cycle of cuts that tore away portions of her clothes and severely damaged the skin on her face, arms, and legs. When she struck a low-lying branch, it all came to an abrupt stop and she lost her breath. As Tenten struggled to support herself on the branch, Naruto halted his jutsu and approached her slowly. As he approached, he spun his kukiras, keeping an eye out for any movement that would necessitate his quick response. It was evident to him that the Hakai no Kei's Haro had caused her harm. But if he had used the amount of chakra needed to perform that jutsu, it would have been even more devastating. Naruto was not entirely unharmed. Tenten had cut and bruised him multiple times during their initial head-on encounter, and his lip was bleeding from the contact between her foot and his head. Tenten had finally managed to get both of her feet on top of the tree limb when Naruto arrived at a stoop a yard from her location. She was having trouble breathing and had to keep her eye closed due to a blood-seeping cut above it. As she inhaled, she looked at Naruto with a mix of wonder and disgust and asked, "What the hell was that?" Naruto gave her a sly smile as he positioned himself and quickly started to move in her direction. He slashed at her with both blades after applying chakra to his legs and feet as he ran through the trees to her location. Tenten moved quickly, blocking his blades with her ornamental staff while grunting and trying to strengthen her arms to prevent Naruto's blades from sweeping off her staff. She pushed harder as she leapt forward, taking advantage of her crouched position, and fell to the ground below with Naruto. The lower part of their bodies attempted to add to it with knee drives and kicks while the upper part fought for supremacy in pushing the other's weapon or weapons away in midair. With a loud crash, they finally came to rest on the ground. Tenten had landed hard against Naruto, causing both of them to lose their weapons. As Naruto tilted his wrist back and reached for her neck, where a senbon needle protruded from a mechanical wrist device that would either launch or extend the already long needle forward, Tenten instantly produced a kunai that she had concealed in her sleeve and brought it to her neck. As they both gasped for air, they stared each other down while holding their pointed objects near each other's jugular vein. Panting, he asked, "Do you yield?" "Do you?" she replied, but her hand was trembling. Hayate said, "That's enough. It's a draw, you two." He, Yugo, Guy, and Lee approached the two who were still cautiously staring at one another while they gradually lowered their weapons away from their opponent's neck. Tenten was then a little embarrassed because she thought that the way she was positioned on top of Naruto might give the impression that she was straddling him to someone who hadn't witnessed the fight. She huffed as she pushed the thought from her mind, turning a little red in the cheeks. She then got up and limped away from Naruto as he also stood up. Naruto turned to face Lee and the adults, pulling the senbon back into his device beneath his sleeve. "So, how did we do?" With her back to them, Guy observed Tenten leaning against a distant tree. He secretly grinned because he wanted this to happen because she and Neji were both experiencing a superiority complex, and this was just what she needed to come down to earth and be truthful about her abilities. Guy quickly folded his arms and turned back to Naruto. "Well, for one thing you need to either create a stable taijutsu for yourself or to find one that suits you as the, whatever it was you were using. I wouldn't dare call it a taijutsu." Naruto nodded after explaining that, aside from the academies, which he felt didn't feel right with his body, he had no taijutsu for himself in the first place. "Tenten, would you like to add anything?" Guy asked, turning to face Tenten. Tenten simply shook her head slowly without responding. For the first time since they arrived in the Valley of the End, Naruto drew his sword and sighed as he approached her. Yugo said, "Naruto, what are you doing?" He had no need to draw his weapon because the fight was over. When Tenten heard Yugo calling after Naruto, she turned her head and then her entire body to see Naruto coming toward her brandishing his sword. Then, believing he intended to carry on their altercation, she retreated a step. "Relax, you're hurt, right?" Naruto grinned. Tenten gave a nod. Before turning the sword and holding the blade in one hand while the hilt was in the other, Naruto nodded as well. "Now, I want you to kneel and remain perfectly still, all right? If you move, this won't work." At his words, Tenten arched an eyebrow. She obeyed, curious as to where this was going, her gaze never leaving Naruto's, which for some reason seemed to take on a faint glow. Tenten watched as he closed his eyes, held the weapon over her head, and uttered, "Escalibur no Jutsu, Iyasa." Tenten's cuts vanished as if they had never existed, and all of her bruises, abrasions, and even the cut above her eye vanished and healed in a matter of seconds. Suddenly, she was surrounded by green light, and all of her aching muscles relaxed and regained their strength. In utter disbelief, Tenten gazed at Naruto and his weapon. First, because he was healing her, and second, because of the power this sword possessed. She was even more amazed when she noticed that Naruto's wounds were also healing. When it was all over, Tenten was still staring at Naruto in utter amazement as he resheathed Escalibur and extended his hand. She sighed, took his hand, and stood back up. She then placed her hands on her hips and scowled a little. "Why didn't you use that sword in our spar? Is it your trump card?" Naruto closed his eyes, crossed his arms, and appeared to be thinking about something. "I could have," he replied, "but the techniques and jutsus, with the exception of the one I used on us, are not suited for an evaluation spar." Sighing, Tenten said, "I do know kenjutsu, you know." Yugo turned her attention to Naruto and remarked, "But you're not an expert on the subject." "Naruto, I do understand your reasons with safeguarding the fact you possess that sword of yours, but you really should have used it in your spar as we need to know all of your abilities, not just some if we are to train you properly." "I thought Hayate-sensei was going to spar against me. I was saving it for then," Naruto clarified. Hayate gave a headshake. "Not today, Naruto. However, seeing how you utilize your other weapons, I can have, at least, a safe guess as to what your proficiency with your sword. We will be having a spar, I assure you, but in the meantime, I would like to give you an evaluation on your performance. While being proficient, you've led too many openings to your opponent and seem to play more on power over strategy, which could cost you on a mission, when faced with an unknown enemy. Your skills are right on the mark and you seem to grasp what you can do with your arsenal, but you also seem to disregard how much of it you use, and that too will cost you. Naruto nodded without objecting because he was thinking the same thing as he reflected on the match. The goal is always the same. Strike the enemy down and leave no room for them to attack you with full force. Yugo continued. You also gave her time to recover, which is something no shinobi can afford when facing an enemy. Guy nodded and then turned to Tenten. Tenten, what they said I would apply to you, as well. You're too overconfident in your abilities and, until today, you had yet to face someone who was either equal or more in strength and skill. This will be your downfall, as you will face equally impressive enemies, if not more so, like Naruto here. Tenten bowed to her sensei after nodding and letting out a sigh. I will remember, Guy-sensei, arigato. After giving a nod, Guy turned to face Naruto. Yugo-san has said directly what I thought, so I shall add no more critique other than that it may be best for you to study all the taijutsu style that the Konoha library has to offer, as I could not identify one that would suit you best. Although Naruto was a little disappointed in his choice, it would allow him to try something new and possibly give him an advantage over his adversaries because, after all, what they don't know will harm them. Tenten continued to stare at the boy who had made an impression on her as she moved forward. Generally speaking, she was not one to concede defeat or acknowledge that her assessments were inaccurate or misleading. She would, however, significantly alter this situation. She extended her hand to Naruto, who gave her a questioning glance. It was a good spar, Naruto. I'll admit, I was wrong in my assumption of you, and I've never been happier. It'll be a pleasure to work with you in the future on missions and in future trainings. Naruto took her hand and shook it with a sincere smile. Yosh. With Naruto, our flames shall burn brightly and our enemies shall wither and fall, exclaimed Lee, who had been unusually silent the entire time. He raised both of his arms in the air. With their hands still clasped, Naruto and Tenten both perspired at Lee's cry before chuckling uneasily. Sarutobi was interviewing a client at the Hokage Tower who wanted a cell to come watch over him while he finished a bridge. The man, who was graying, slightly overweight, bespectacled, and had calloused hands, grunted and exhaled a sake-smelling breath. So, this team you'll send with me, they're experienced, right? Sarutobi nodded to him, making a concerted effort to avoid displaying any symptoms of being overcome by the man's alcoholic odor. They'll be the best, I assure you, Tazuna-san. In Naruto's opinion, the following day proved to be peculiar. According to word of mouth from the majority of the village's seasoned shinobi, genin typically began their careers by completing nearly 100 routine D-class missions, which were tasks that promoted teamwork in and of themselves. Never to be given anything higher until the Hokage and the team's sensei agree that they are deserving of a more difficult task. Naruto was shocked to learn that the Hokage had already given him a mission outside of the Villagia A C-class mission, at that while he was standing in the Hokage's office with both of his senseis. This development caught Naruto off guard, and his response was similar to that of Iruka, who was helping the Hokage distribute missions during the summer break from school. Excuse me, Hokage-sama, but isn't it a little early for Naruto to be taking on a mission of this level? He hasn't done any of the required D missions that all genin are required to take. Not only that, he doesn't have 2 teammates to help him in this mission. Iruka responded. The Hokage raised his hand. While I appreciate your concern for your former student, Iruka-san, he's far exceeded the expectations set for those who need to take the D-class missions. Thus, he'll be taking on this mission, which I assure is nothing more than a mere escort mission. The Hokage then glanced at Hayate and Yugo. Will Guy's students be available for this mission? The Hokage nodded in response to Hayate's affirmative nod, then glanced past the group and called to his secretary outside. Please send him in, now. When the door opened, a grizzly old man wearing glasses was seen holding a bottle of sake, some of which was dripping off his chin and bottom lip. The group in the Hokage's office caught his reddened, drunken eyes, which were squinted. This is it? Man. Money does not get you far, now does it? I ask for seasoned shinobi, and you give me a guy who looks like he's about to kick it any second, a woman who looks like she belongs running an onsen, and a runt with a bizarre fashion sense. But then the runt vanished from his line of sight and appeared before him brandishing a kunai that was pointed at the man's family jewels. Naruto sneered before putting away his kunai and turning to face his senseis. This runt is going to be protecting you. Don't be so quick to judge just because of how I dress or my height, you old drunk. He bowed and left the room, leaving a wide-eyed Tazuna clutching his parts defensively and appearing uncomfortable. I'll be waiting at the gate, senseis. With a sly smile, Yugo turned to face the man and whispered in his ear while placing her hand on his shoulder. She gave him a quick pat on the shoulder and left in the same manner as Naruto, saying, "Take heed of what he said." With a sigh, Hayate accepted the assignment scroll from the Hokage and proceeded to speak with Tazuna in order to obtain additional details. When Yugo, Tenten, and Lee arrived, Naruto was already waiting by the gate. He could tell that Tenten was bored, which likely indicated that she had been informed about the mission by Yugo and wasn't particularly excited about it. Lee, on the other hand, exuded determination and seriousness. Tenten frowned as they joined him and gave Naruto a thorough examination. "Why are you looking like that? It doesn't suit you." After giving her a brief glance, Naruto was going to tell her that it was none of her business when she crossed her arms and cut him off. "Look, if we're going to be teammates, I want you to be honest with me and not hold anything back that may jeopardize either this mission or another in the future. Lee and I are going to be depending on you, so please don't put us at arm's length like most of the prodigies in our class do." The comment she made Naruto wince. It was a slight to compare him to Sasuke and Neji, but he could appreciate her concern. But the secret, or reason, was something significant and intimate. He struggled greatly with trust, even with people his own age. But despite his reluctance to acknowledge it, Tenten was correct. With a sigh, Naruto turned to face Yugo and said, "Yugo nay, if you would, please." After giving a nod, Yugo demonstrated some hand signals and used a high genjutsu and soundproof jutsu to obfuscate what was being seen and heard. A barrier was then built to enclose them. Naruto turned away from his teammates after she was done. He could not see their reaction, but he knew they had nodded when he said, "What you're about to hear is an S-class secret, punishable by death should you reveal it without the consent of myself or the Hokage, understood?" Then he turned back to them, a serious expression on his face. "What do you to know about what happened with the Kyuubi attack that happened 13 years ago?" "Yosh! The Yondaime had defeated it and saved the village," Lee shouted. Tenten nodded in agreement with Lee's succinct, if noisy, account of the events. Nodded. "That's what we were taught, yes, however, that is a half-truth." Confused, Tenten tilted her head to the side. "Excuse me?" Sighed, the Yondaime could not eliminate the Kyuubi, a being of immense demonic chakra, with ninja skills. No matter how powerful and talented as he was left with only one alternative, one he had made himself. If he could not kill it, he could only do something that would end its rampage and save the village. He would have to trap it, or seal it, rather, into an object. Now solid matter would never be able to hold a being of this size or its destructive power. So, in other words, he would have to put it in something that would be stable enough to hold it within. Close them again before opening with a calm demeanor. He would have to seal it inside a human being. Lee gasped as Tenten's eyes grew wide. Naruto nodded in response to their startled looks. Yes, he would have to imprison it inside a living person. However, as far as chakra coils go, living adults are too developed and thus would tear in response the demonic chakra mixing in with their own. So, Naruto breathed a sigh of relief as a newborn baby would have to be the container. Tenten and Lee both fell silent, but it was still possible to see their eyes widening and their faces mouthing silent words. The first to get better was Tenten. So you. After nodding, Naruto grinned sorrowfully. "The Yondaime chose me, an orphan whose parents had died during the Kyuubi attack, to seal the Kyuubi inside and thus saving the village. That is, until 6 years ago when something extraordinary happened and the Kyuubi was expunged from my body, leaving only its chakra behind, which was converted into my own." Lee appeared perplexed. "If that's true, Naruto-san, then why are you still looked on with unyouthful hate from the citizens?" But Tenten appeared to make a guess more quickly than Lee. "They don't know, do they?" Nodded. "Even if they did, most of them wouldn't believe it. They've clung onto the belief that I'm the reincarnation that had brought them so much unhappiness and sorrow, that if they were told otherwise, they'd most likely disregard it. The council is very much the same, or at least, a large portion of it. So, I've kept up the pretense that I'm the demon brat. So no one will have the baseless assumption that I'm being controlled by the Kyuubi, which is where their thoughts will lead, should they learn my secret. A lot of the shinobi population is of the same mind," Yugo said. "If any of them were under the impression that Naruto was being influenced or controlled by the Kyuubi, they wouldn't hesitate to try and kill Naruto, despite the Hokage's law forbidding anyone from harming Naruto-kun." "How unyouthful." Lee scowled and yelled. "No matter how hard you try, some people are unwilling to change, and I'm not going to force them to," said Naruto. Tenten gazed at Naruto, feeling both sad and amazed. She was saddened to learn about everything he was going through, whether it was for self-defense or to maintain the regrettable coping strategies the residents employed to move past what had happened 13 years prior. However, why? Tenten didn't comprehend that. Why should he be forced to do it, and why should he put up with their repeated acts of abuse and contempt? It was selfless but on the verge of masochism. What had he got to gain in the end? She recalled him loudly stating his desire to become Hokage, but was that a genuine statement or was it just a ploy to keep proving the Konoha residents were correct in their beliefs? What do you hope to accomplish by continuing this lie about yourself? Tenten inquired. Sighing, by becoming the best shinobi I can be and that my accomplishments circumvent their attitudes toward me. It may take me my entire life or it may be shorter than that, whatever it may be. I'm going to be patient. They have a right to hate the Kyuubi for what it did to them and I will not deny them that right. Sensing that Hayate and Tazuna were coming, Yugo made the decision to end the situation. We need to end this, you guys. Tenten, Lee, I don't think I need to remind the two of you that everything you heard is both confidential and an S-class secret. I hope that my faith in the two of you isn't misjudged and you're going to be telling everybody about Naruto's secret. Tenten and Lee shook their heads. As Hayate and Tazuna approached them, Yugo nodded and then threw off the jutsu. Hayate said, "Everybody ready?" Everybody gave a nod. After Hayate nodded, the six of them quickly got ready and made their way to the village gates, with two of them having a lot on their minds. 3 hours into the journey, Naruto saw that their client's eyes were darting back and forth into the clearings across from the road they were traveling on, and he appeared so nervous that he was on the verge of sweating. Given that this specific road was notorious for bandits robbing travelers, it was possible that the bridge builder was being attacked by bandits, according to what Hayate-sensei had said about this mission. Accordingly, it was figuring out the source of his anxiety, but Naruto suspected it wasn't that easy. He could see the signs in Tazuna, having been dishonest for so long, but he lacked all the information to support his suspicions. He was distracted from Tazuna's strange behavior by a puddle by the side of the road. He examined it with suspicion because the previous week's weather had been dry and traveling merchants hardly ever used the road they were on, making the likelihood that it was something left behind extremely slim. Sensing out, Naruto detected 2 high chakra signatures emanating from the enigmatic puddle. He promptly used hand signals to communicate the situation to his senseis. They responded by gesturing for him to leave as if nothing had changed. They were only a yard from the puddle when the next thing happened. After leaping out of the puddle, 2 ninjas, connected by the wrists with a long chain that had hooked, barbed blades on it, quickly wrapped themselves around Hayate and pulled on their wrists in the opposite direction, creating a hideous scene in which Hayate was torn to pieces. Through his breathing apparatus, one of the shinobi said, "One down, with malice." The mirrored partner added, 4 to go. In order to protect their client, Naruto leapt out and formed 3 cage bushins, each of whom pulled out their kukiras and stood guard. The 2 men were slightly torn and bleeding when Lee leapt over them and seized the chain with the blades in his hands. He pulled the chain backward with unexpected strength, sending the 2 ninjas crashing into one another. Tenten and Yugo acted quickly, drawing blades and cutting the chains that bound them together before engaging in one-on-one combat. After defeating the opponent, Yugo watched helplessly as Tenten, Lee, and Naruto, who had created a second cage bushin to protect Tazuna, took turns eliminating the adversary. They all played a kind of tag-in-tag-out game, covering one another. One ally would step out and recover, while another would arrive to take their place when they were about to be taken by surprise. Although Yugo was immediately impressed and assumed that Guy had most likely introduced this to his students, she was even more impressed by Naruto's discovery of it without being informed. Naruto then faced the enemy as the 3 formed a triangle around their opponent. Instead of going all at once, Naruto entered and pretended to swipe at the man's stomach, making him jump back. The man's vision was diverted when Lee approached from the side and he saw Naruto and Lee approaching him. But he paid a heavy price for his inattention, as she attacked him with 2 tonfas and struck him in the head. As a result, the man became disconcerted, which led to a coordinated attack by Naruto and Lee. Lee performed a roundhouse kick in midair, while Naruto delivered a painful jab to the man's stomach. With a loud crash, the ninja descended after soaring a few feet into the air. He did not rise and lie on his back. In the midst of the silence, a coughing sound alerted the group to Hayate's approach from his hiding spot. The location where he died revealed a butchered log. He grinned and said, "Well done, you 3. As he watched Tenten tie the 2 ninjas to a tree, his smile turned to a frown. They're identified as Noop Nins, deserters of their village, by their Hitai Atesh displaying scratch marks through the emblem of Kirigakure, the village concealed in the mist. He seemed to be asking the entire group, so, what has two, most likely Chunin level, nuke nins coming after the likes of us? Naruto noticed that their client had become more agitated and appeared to be perspiring more. He averted his gaze from the others. Sighing, Tazuna-san, what have you done to have someone send nuke nins after you? Tazuna gazed at Naruto, still in disbelief at the transformation he had witnessed in his appearance. He did his best, poker face, and gulped loudly. He stammered, I don't know what you mean. Yugo scowled. This road is known only for bandit attacks. Your behavior on this journey is questionable, so, it is easy to see why Naruto-kun suspects you of something. Tazuna eagerly glanced at the others to see if anyone had any suspicion that he was keeping something from them, but he couldn't find anyone. With a sigh, he took off his straw hat and dabbed at the last of his perspiration. He continued by explaining his current job, which involved constructing a bridge that would connect the impoverished town of Nami no Kuni, the land of waves, with the phrase, "All right, I'll tell y'all." But doing so would put the man who had opened his business in Nami a few years ago in jeopardy. The completion of the bridge would bring in outside trade, undermining this man's monopoly over Nami's trading sector. The man's name is Gato, and he is well known in the trading community for being both prosperous and brutal in his pursuits. This is our home's only chance to loosen the grasp that tyrant has over us, he concluded. Yes, but you lied to us. More importantly, you lied to the Hokage when you requested this mission. If he had known that there would be missing ninjas after you, he would have assigned this mission a higher ranking and brought in more to get it done, Yugo replied. But we can't afford a higher ranking. It took our entire village to scrap together just for this classification. Look, I'm sorry that I lied, but we need your help. If we don't get this bridge built, our village will slowly perish the more Gato squeezes the rest of the life from us, Tazuna begged. With a sigh, Yugo turned to face Hayate. What do you think, Hayate-kun? There are sure to be other ninjas like these who'll be after us, if not of higher ranking. Once they learn of their defeat, our duty is to head back and ask the Hokage to assign some others to do this. After taking everything in, Hayate turned to face the eager genin who had remained silent throughout Tazuna's explanation. He was aware that he needed to return and raise the case to its current level, but he felt obliged to take a different approach after witnessing Naruto and the others' actions during the attack. Well, you three, what are your thoughts? Yugo-chan's right in this being way out of our league, but I'm interested in your thoughts. Tenten, Lee, the two of you have more experience than Naruto but are still genin. What are your thoughts? We are ninja of the leaf. It is our job to help those who can't help themselves from those that hurt them, Lee emphasized by raising his fist. Tenten exhaled, but Lee, it's also our job to do what we are trained and qualified for. This mission has been underclassed and by directive we should head back to the village. She then glanced at Tazuna. However, we've already gotten into this mission too far and it may turn sour for Tazuna-san. Here should the Hokage dismiss this mission because he lied about the dangers of it. You're right, Lee, both him and his village need our help. So, I'm in. Tazuna turned to face Naruto, who was staring at the road ahead. When he spoke, he didn't look at Tazuna. Tazuna-san, we're going to continue the mission. I hope there are no more secrets as our lives are on the line and we're trusting you as much as you're trusting us. Tenten grinned when she heard that Naruto took what she had said to heart and warned their client in the same way. Tazuna gave a deep breath. You have my word that there's nothing else. Again, I'm sorry for the trouble I'm causing the five of you. Nodded. Very well, I'll send a message to the Hokage about the particulars. Tazuna, you will have to submit a letter of both explanation and apology to the Hokage for lying about the mission. You're going to also be paying the amount this mission should have been labeled. Tazuna scratched the back of his head wearily and nodded, letting out a sigh of relief. All right, that's fair. After giving a nod, Hayate turned to face Yugo, who had opened a scroll and wiped it with her blood, causing a cloud of smoke to envelop it and a hawk to appear in its center. Yugo wrote on a small piece of paper, then rolled it up and placed it in the small leg tube that was attached to the hawk's leg. The hawk screeched as it surveyed its new surroundings. When she was done, the hawk flew off in the direction of Konoha, and the five gathered their belongings and proceeded to Nami no Kuni. As they traveled farther, the group grew more cautious. Nobody was as carefree as they had been before the attack and the new information. There was very little talking, and breaks were getting harder to come by. Since their client felt he was already on tentative terms with his ninja escorts, he tolerated it without complaining. As they traveled, they came to a wide body of water where, according to Tazuna, A boat was waiting to transport them the remaining distance to Nami. The Konoha nins became tense as soon as they saw the boat because of a fog and an unsettling atmosphere. Yugo ordered, "You three protect Tazuna." A rabbit fled in terror as Tenten threw one of her kunai in the direction of the rustle in the bushes while they were forming up. As the rabbit scampered out of sight, Lee sighed and said, "That was unyouthful, Tenten." However, Hayate had noticed that the rabbit's fur was white, and due to the region, the rabbit was not indigenous to this area, which could only imply. He shouted, "Everybody, heads down," as a huge spinning object flew over where their heads would have been before it struck a tree. It turned out to be a large zanbadu that resembled a big knife rather than a sword. A man stood on its hilt, watching them from the corner of his eye while facing away from them. Well, what have we here? A bunch of leaf nins and their brats. Give the bridge builder to me and you can all go on your way." Yugo pulled out her katanas and said, "That's Zabuza Momochi." Hayate nodded and followed suit, keeping his gaze fixed on Zabuza. "What's a missing nin, such as yourself, want with him? Doing Gado's dirty work?" With a sneer, Zabuza said, "If it weren't for the runt's money, I wouldn't even bother." He then grabbed the blade, pulled it from the tree, and held it on his shoulders while glancing at the group. "I'll ask you one last time, abandon the old geezer and you'll leave with your lives and limbs." Hayate turned to face Naruto and the other two, who were watching over Tazuna, who was clearly trembling. "Guard the client with your life, we'll handle Zabuza, got it?" The three gave a nod, and Zabuza simultaneously raised his hands in a circle. He remarked, "Kirigakure no Jutsu." As the misty fog surrounding them appeared to thicken, the three were soon unable to see either their senseis or the enemy. But soon, both male and female grunting could be heard, along with sword fights. The three genin were experiencing extreme anxiety as the minutes passed, their eyes fixed on the battlefield. A voice yelled, "Now die!" from behind them. On top of the trembling Tazuna, the three turned to see Zabuza leaping forward with his enormous sword. Then there was a loud clashing sound as Naruto emerged behind Tazuna, his sword Escalibur out and preventing Zabuza's blade from approaching its victim. Zabuza's enormous strength caused Naruto to strain. The strain his muscles were under from Zabuza's force was causing them to scream in agony. As Zabuza took a step back, Naruto grunted and said, "P protect T Tazuna, I got this." Pushing all of his weight forward and stumbling a little. Then Naruto summoned 3 Kage Bushins, one of whom took his place in the formation surrounding Tazuna, while the others joined him in the fight against Zabuza. As he and his clones positioned themselves, Zabuza grinned and gave the boy a curious look. "That's an interesting sword you got there, brat. When you're dead, it'll make a fine addition to my collection." Without responding, Naruto and his clones closed their eyes and started gathering chakra while emitting a blue aura around their bodies. When their eyes opened, the once cerulean blue hue became more distinct and intensely glowing. Zabuza raised an imaginary eyebrow in response to the boy's actions and appearance. Together, the 3 Narutos yelled, "Excalibur no Jutsu, Tosatsu, Art of Excalibur, Annihilate," before abruptly vanishing. Zabuza's eyes grew wide as he abruptly raised his blade in front of him to block the 3 Narutos' barrage of blows, thrusts, and swings. Their power was unimaginable for a mere genin to possess, and their blades had a celestial glow. One of the Narutos appeared behind him and thrust forward at his exposed back, cutting right through, while the other 2 appeared in front of him and delivered a devastating horizontal swipe that moved his sword away from him. But before long, Zabuza shrank, changed into water, and splashed to the ground with his sword. 2 of the 3 Narutos scattered, leaving one standing on one knee, gasping for breath, his arms trembling. After witnessing the entire event, Tazuna and his team were astounded by the boy's abilities. Their thoughts about Naruto, however, came to an end when the fog quickly dissipated and they focused on the area where Hayate and Yugo had previously confronted Zabuza. There, they saw Hayate on the water's surface in the center of the stream and Yugo on the ground, clutching her injured arm and leg. Zabuza was holding him in a sphere of water while he looked at the genin group encircling Tazuna. "Here's the deal. Your sensei's life for that old man's." Naruto frowned, as did the others. With a nasty gash on his shoulder that he was clutching, Hayate also appeared injured, and Yugo was weakly attempting to stand. "Don't worry about me," he shouted, "protect the client, that's your first duty." With his legs imitating his still trembling arms, Naruto stood back on his feet. He glanced at his teammates and saw the same determination in their faces. He turned to Tazuna, who appeared to understand where their thoughts were, and nodded at them. Go ahead and get your sensei, it's fine by me, he said. After nodding, Naruto turned to face Tenten, who also nodded and produced 3 Fuma shurikens. Lee seized 2 and accelerated in the direction of the 2 on the water. Zabuza laughed. Looks like they're disregarding your order, Leaf Nin. This'll be amusing while it lasts. The pain echoed to Hayate's injured shoulder, causing him to shudder and cough. He pondered what the 3 might be contemplating. Lee stopped short of Yugo's position and delivered the 2 windmill shurikens with lethal precision to Zabuza. Zabuza grinned as he leapt over them, but his eyes grew wide when he noticed 2 more approaching him directly. He arched his back in time to see the 2 lethal spinning blades sail over him, his hand still holding the water prison on Hayate. When he eventually returned to the ground, he saw that the child in green spandex had successfully retrieved one of their 2 senseis, while the girl with the bun was preparing more throwing weapons to attack him. It'll take more than that to get at me. Now hand over the old man, he shouted. Escalibur no Jutsu, Terasu, Art of Escalibur, Blaze. Zabuza turned his head and saw the blonde child running toward him on the water's surface with his special weapon, which was now blazing in flames. Zabuza reached for his sword with his free hand, ready to block the blow, but as the 2 blades collided, sparks that felt like a barrage of white-hot embers hit his eyes. He was starting to feel uneasy because the heat from the flames seemed to burn his skin when it came into close proximity. The flames grew stronger as Naruto added more chakra to Escalibur. Although he couldn't defeat the man by strength, he could use the extra heat to make him release Hayate's sensei from the prison. The outcome worked in his favor because Zabuza stumbled and let Hayate out of his captivity as the heat increased. After that, Zabuza retreated and stood guard while Hayate quickly stood up and prepared his own sword. Between his sensei, a seasoned kenjutsu expert, and the blonde mystery with the amazing sword, Zabuza felt that he should have been paid more for this position. Zabuza cautiously observed both of his rivals. He could no longer afford to disregard either of them since they had both exceeded his expectations. Jutsus were out of the question if he wanted to make a quick escape because his chakra was already low. He glanced at each of his opponents and saw that the sickly-looking Junin was trying not to hold the wound where Zabuza had grazed his shoulder, and the blonde brat was trying to avoid getting tired. However, he could tell by the determined expressions in their eyes that both of them had it in them and that they were not disabled. There were very few options available to him, and any mistake he made could potentially lead to his death. In this case, it would probably be best for him to play it smart. Zabuza frowned even more when the blonde, now unexpectedly, produced 5 cage bushins. Actually, not because of what transpired, but rather because of what he has become in retrospective, the demon of the bloody mist reduced to this. In order to become a genin for Kirigakure, he killed every other participant during his academy years. Because of his reputation, even the most seasoned shinobi were afraid of his name. Zabuza growled as he went into overdrive, slashing viciously at every blonde he could find and reducing them to the original. Zabuza turned on one leg and attacked both the pupil and the sensei after the sick man attacked him from his side. The blonde's skin was scorched and blistered by the heat and sparks from the collision between his sword and the ignited flame blade, which still hurt like a son of a bitch. By attacking the man with ease from various parts of his body, the sickly man's attacks appeared to try to divert his attention from the man's pupil, so Zabuza protected each and every one of those areas. Escalibur no Jutsu, Ashuru, Art of Escalibur, Dominate. Zabuza turned his head as he saw the blonde approaching him again, but this time the sword was no longer blazing with fire. Instead, its owner was surrounded by a Han blue aura, and his eyes were practically burning with the same hue. About 2 feet away from Zabuza, the boy screeched to a stop and swung the sword from the bottom up high to Zabuza's midsection. After tasting the boy's limited strength, Zabuza was taken aback by the force of the blow the boy delivered, and as he raised his blade to defend, he soon found himself seeing blurred surroundings. He flew to a big tree and left a full body imprint in the bark. The world started to spin around him, and he coughed up blood after breaking 6 ribs and puncturing his left lung. At this point, 2 thin, sharp projectiles suddenly pierced his neck and emerged from the opposite side, causing him to feel a new kind of pain. As Zabuza entered the darkness, he came to the realization that everything was leaving him from this world. A figure with long black and obsidian hair tied at the end and a hunter nin's mask bearing Kirigakure's signature on top appeared, and Naruto scowled. The individual gave a bow and said, "Thank you, all of you, for subduing Zabuza long enough so that I could take him out. I was afraid my abilities wouldn't suffice in taking out such a powerful nuke nin." Hayate cast a wary glance at the hunter nin before focusing on the motionless Zabuza. He approached the man and touched his neck with 2 fingers. He coughed and spoke out loud after finding no pulse. "He's dead, then." Tenten and Tazuna's sighs of relief were audible to him. But as he turned to face the group, he noticed Yugo and, somewhat unexpectedly, Naruto observing the hunter with distrustful eyes. The hunter Nin approached Zabuza's body, raised it, and grasped his weapon with the other hand before both he and Zabuza's form disappeared in an instant. After they left, Hayate fell to the ground in exhaustion and was quickly helped back up by Naruto, who appeared to be just as worn out as Hayate. In addition to Naruto and himself, Hayate noticed that Yugo was looking a little worse for wear because she had a gaping wound on one arm and another on her leg. Tenten and Lee appeared worn out, either mentally or emotionally, from having to be on guard and prepared in case they had to take action. Even though Tazuna appeared relieved, the anxiety seemed to be about to overwhelm him. As Naruto assisted Hayate in reaching the group, he asked, "Is there a place in town you would recommend us to stay, Tazuna-san?" Tazuna said, "You all are welcome to stay at my place. I'm sure my daughter and grandson would love the company." She sighed before grinning. Hayate nodded, then winced as his injured shoulder hurt when he moved his head. They reached Tazuna's house in less than 3 hours. As they observed the dilapidated state of the once thriving town, the group came to understand why Tazuna was so keen to make a difference by constructing his bridge, which would generate revenue for the village itself. Gado's control over the town was demonstrated by the prices of the goods being sold by individuals whose air was one of smug superiority. Most of the people appeared gaunt, and there was little to no gleam in their eyes. The sights they witnessed caused the Konoha group to feel either pity, anger, or unease. A young woman who appeared extremely relieved at the sight of her father's return welcomed them to Tazuna's home, which was a charming 2-story home by the sea. "Tu-san. You're back. I was so worried when you left that one of Gado's thugs were going to get to you," she exclaimed as she threw herself into her father's arms. He gestured to the group behind him and said, "It's thanks to these brave men and women that I'm alive." Tsunami eventually glanced past her father at them. She released her father, walked over to the group, and bowed to them. "Thank you, all of you, for protecting my father and accepting this job." Hayate dismissed her worries, saying, "It's no problem, Tsunami-san. It's our job and we're happy to help someone in need." His speech was devoid of the usual coughing fit because, just hours before, Naruto had given him the opportunity to recover from his wounds from fighting Zabuza. He was initially a little hesitant to use his sword's unique ability to heal because of his pride, which made him prefer to do it himself. But he soon changed his mind after a subsequent disagreement with Yugo, because he wasn't as constrained as he had been previously and didn't have to push himself past his limits. He felt better about the choice. Naruto jokingly expressed his happiness at having a sensei who would not perish during his Chunin career. For that, Hayate had given him a hard blow to the head. The group was led inside by Tsunami, who first showed them to the guest quarters, a room separated by a sliding paper mesh screen. On one side of the screen, the men placed their possessions, and on the other, the 2 female companions. After they were done, Tsunami invited them to dinner, and they soon found themselves in the tiny dining room where a small boy wearing a bucket-shaped hat avoided the group. Small, charming conversations had taken place around the table during dinner as they consumed their food. But all discussions were quickly cut off by a small, reserved voice. "Go back. Soon." Inari, Tsunami's son, was the center of attention. Tenten raised an eyebrow and said, "Excuse me?" Inari revealed his face for the first time since they had met, and it was filled with a hateful frown. With each word, he appeared to shake with unrestrained rage. "I said, go back. Leave. Go away. None of you are any match for Gato and his men. Your being here will only get yourselves killed and my mom and my grandpa for having you here, so leave." He was now standing. Naruto surprised everyone by saying, "Not going to happen." He hadn't spoken since he healed Hayate. "We were hired to do a job and that's to protect your grandfather while he finishes the bridge and saves your town. That doesn't matter. You're all still going to die. Gato was way too many men. He'll slaughter you all." Inari slammed his fists on the table. After giving Inari a brief glance, Naruto closed his eyes and sighed, saying, "Wow, this guy scares you a lot, huh?" Inari's eyes appeared to well up with tears, but he remained silent. "This whole village seems to have lost its spark and I can see that in you as well," Naruto said with sadness. "However, Gato doesn't intimidate me. He hides behind money and the men that he gets with that money. He's nothing but a weak little tyrant. Take away his men and his money that he uses to influence people and you have nothing. He's a coward preying upon those who can't fight back or are too afraid to." You're only high and mighty because you've probably been living the easy life. You've never known pain and fear, Inari said, gritting his teeth and pointing at Naruto. Naruto got up, and his chair fell to the ground with a slam. He squinted at Inari, who appeared somewhat alarmed by Naruto's abrupt transformation. Naruto frowned at Inari, his eyes glowing a dark sapphire. Do you really want to play a game of whose life is worse? We can, if you like, although I already know the outcome of the game. Naruto, said Hayate alarmingly. After closing his eyes and letting out a frustrated sigh, Naruto turned and left the room. Tenten started to say, Naruto, but Naruto interrupted. I'm going to train. Nobody intervened to stop him, and nobody said anything until he was gone. However, Inari frowned after the boy and went back to his room. After the two boys had left, Tazuna expressed regret for his grandson's actions and, when asked, related a story about a man Inari looked up to as a surrogate father who was the first and last to stand up to Gato and his men. His passing not only meant that Inari's hope was over, but also that of the entire village. By the time the story ended, the majority of the Konoha nins were preoccupied with what they had learned about the despot Gato and how it related to the two new men who were working for him. The entire group was informed that the phony hunter nin was actually one of Zabuza's colleagues, which would indicate that he was recovering and would likely attack again in a week. They were able to comprehend the fear that the town experienced during Gato's reign of terror because they knew these two people and how wealthy Gato was. Naruto had no idea why the little child's words were causing him to become so agitated. He believed that he had already moved past the point at which he allowed someone to irritate him to that degree. However, Naruto was enraged to be around someone who had family support when he didn't and to never have to live in constant danger. Naruto let out all of his rage by creating several dozen cage bushins and using all of his skills and techniques to fight those clothes. After defeating the final clone, Naruto collapsed against the tree, exhausted both mentally and physically. He soon fell asleep, and he was glad of it. The only thing that woke him from his dreamless slumber was the sound of approaching footsteps. He used his other senses to determine who it was while keeping his eyes closed. It wasn't his family, the bridge builder, or any of his teammates. When he first smelled the blood on the person, he was about to write it off as a normal person, most likely from the town. It was old, but it smelled like Zabuza when he was hurt. When Naruto's eyes opened, he turned his attention to the one who was going to wake him up and retracted their hand. Wearing a flower-patterned kimono and a purple obi tied around her body with a bow made in the back, she was roughly Naruto's age. Her long, dark earth-colored hair was pulled back to her waist in a ponytail. She smelled of lilac and herbs in addition to the scent of Zabuza's blood. The only conclusion Naruto could draw was that she was most likely the hunter nin in disguise who had assisted Zabuza. Warmly, she said, "You're going to catch a cold out here." Naruto yawned as he stood up and stretched, trying to hide his curiosity by appearing sleepy. She either didn't recognize him, which was unlikely given the color of his hair, or she thought he was a threat and was going to take advantage of his lack of awareness of who she was, most likely in an attempt to learn more about him and the group. But that game could be played by two. With his trademark fox-like smile, he asked, "What you doing out here so late, yourself?" The girl pointed to the basket beside her with a smile. "I'm gathering herbs. A friend of mine is really sick and I'm collecting these to help make him better." When she admitted that she was treating Zabuza, Naruto grinned to himself. He wasn't shocked that he was still alive, and he was going to take full advantage of this to extract some information from her. "Really? That's too bad. How did he get hurt?" She took a while to respond this time. She studied him for a moment, then smiled back at him. He had an accident. It was brief, but Naruto didn't reveal that he suspected she was someone else or that he knew more. "What are you doing out here?" she inquired, glancing at the surrounding area's deformed trees and numerous scorch marks. With a proud swell of his chest for show, Naruto declared, "Training. I'm a ninja." She smiled calmly. "Really? A ninja? That must be a hard life." He sheepishly scratched the back of his head and said, "It is." He had her now, hook, line, and sinker. Could I help you, maybe, miss?" he asked, glancing first at her basket and then back at her. Not as long as before, she gave him a look before nodding and grinning. For a while, the two of them looked for the specific herbs she required. Naruto was taken aback by her proficiency with herbology because, when he showed her two plants that he thought were identical, she quickly pointed out his mistake because the leaves on those plants differed slightly in shape. Naruto was impressed, but he reminded himself that she was the enemy and slowly let it die. But nothing could have prepared him for what lay ahead. She inquired, "What's your name?" He said, "Naruto, and yours?" As they continued their conversation, she smiled and said, "Haku." She continued to pull up the herbs. "Tell me, Naruto, do you have someone precious to you?" When Naruto heard the question, his eyes widened, and he mentally repeated it multiple times before giving a tense response. What do you mean? Do you have someone precious? Someone that you'd lay down everything, including your life, so that they would always be safe?" Haku asked, laughing before repeating her query. Naruto swallowed and gave her question serious thought. The old man Hokage, the Ichirakus, Iruka-sensei, Yuga-one, Hayate-sensei, Tenten, and Rock Lee were among the many faces that emerged in response to the intimidating question. He grinned. I was taken aback that a question this straightforward could lead to such a profound discovery. In fact, he had a large number of people who were very important to him. Naruto nodded as he turned back to face Haku. I do. Quite a bit, actually. She replied, they're what make you strong. Whenever you have something or someone precious to fight for, they'll make you stronger because you are fighting for them. After listening to her speech, Naruto scowled as he considered it. He recalled how, while defending Naruto from Mizuki, Iruka found himself in danger, and vice versa. He saw another scene in which he was attempting to protect the Ichirakus, and he was warned that the ramen cooks might suffer a terrible fate if he returned there ever again. Naruto recalled feeling bad when he found out because he had ignored the fact that Tsuchi had a black eye and Ayame had 3 broken fingers. Both had assured Naruto that the Hokage was investigating the situation and that he didn't have to worry about them. Naruto was greatly affected by it, and he became less and less motivated to exact revenge on those who might harm the people he loved. He sighed and turned away from Haku, lingering on these memories. While I agree that having to protect those that are precious to you can give you the additional strength and drive, there are times where it can weaken you as well. Haku's eyes appeared to narrow, but she soon transformed back into her attractive self. Really? Why is that? Naruto turned to face her in a reserved manner. If an enemy were to learn of things that made your life positive, the people that brought joy to it, they'd use that against you. The precious people in your life would be a constant target and, depending on the situation, because of how precious they are to you, they'd pay the price for having known you, or an endless spiral of suffering would be the final result for both parties. Naruto saw the abrupt shift in her eyes as she fought to maintain her Fa Section 8 and control her emotions. Considering that he had performed a similar role throughout his life, Naruto was impressed by her performance. Both of their performances will now come to an end. Is Zabuza your precious person, Haku-san? You went through an awful lot of trouble to get him away from us, under the disguise of killing him as a Kiri hunter nin. Now, you're gathering herbs to heal his wounds. He must mean a lot to you, am I right? Haku's face displayed a range of emotions, including surprise, denial, and outrage. She jumped away from Naruto and waited for Naruto to move while crouching and holding 3 senbon needles between her fingers. Naruto brought out Tsuki and Byakuya and hurled himself in the direction of the kunoichi. After deflecting the senbon with his kukiris, Naruto threw an exploding capsule at her, stopping her from performing the shunshin through a one-handed seal process. As she was hurtled a few feet away, she was caught and wrapped in a net of ninja wire with weights attached at the end. Naruto leapt onto her position right away and was about to attack her when an ice dome that had forced itself around her threw him back. After clinging to a tree with chakra, Naruto leapt forward to the dome and used Escalibur to cut through one of the panels. Inside, he discovered Haku gone and the remnants of his wire net. But before long, her image filled the dome's panels, her face smeared with bruises and displaying obvious annoyance. She flew from one panel to the next, hurling hundreds upon hundreds of senbon at Naruto as she said, "At first I thought it'd be best just to leave you and return to Zabuza-sama, but..." Her appearance was more muted when she reappeared in each of her panels. "I think I'll teach you a lesson in mocking other people's beliefs." Naruto gave her a frown. "That's not what I was doing." Either not hearing his response or completely ignoring it, Haku kept moving from panel to panel and hurling an infinite quantity of senbon at him. Now, Naruto was nearly entirely covered in needles, which were wearing down his muscles. "Iyasa, heal," he uttered, causing all of the senbon to shoot from his body. "Excalibur no Jutsu, Tate, shield," he exclaimed, bringing Excalibur and the scabbard out in front of him vertically. All of Haku's senbon bounced off the blue glow surrounding Naruto's body. Haku paused inside one of her panels to both catch her breath and look in wonder at what he had accomplished. Up until now, it appeared that her senbon could get past every obstacle one of her adversaries put up. Naruto rocketed toward her and slashed out with his sword, interrupting her thoughts. Haku barely made it out of the panel before Naruto hit her with a hard right hook to the back, sending her crashing into the ground and breaking her jutsu, shattering the dome against the ground. As Haku tried to stand up again, she shuddered and Naruto appeared behind her, holding a kunai at her throat. He let go of her after she gave him a forceful elbow to the stomach, and then she punched him in the jaw. Naruto swiftly recovered and punched her in the stomach after grabbing her wrist. Gasping for breath, she fell to the ground and tried to stand up to strike his face, but he struck her across the face, sending her back down. Then, with her teeth clenched, Haku swept her legs and knocked Naruto onto his back. Naruto moaned as he stood up again for the third round, only to discover Haku still on the ground, gasping for air. Still in pain from her punch, Naruto rolled onto his stomach and walked toward her. When he got to her, she lashed out at him with her fists and arms, her eyes turning feral, but he grabbed her wrists and struggled with her flailing arms like someone trying to choke an eel. But fatigue overcame her, and she allowed her head to drop back to the floor. With a defeated tone, she said, "Do it." At her command, Naruto raised an eyebrow, breathing nearly as hard as she was. "Do what?" Haku gave him a frown. "Kill me." Before they narrowed, Naruto's eyes widened, his teeth were clenched. "No, I won't kill someone who's so much like me. It'd be like killing a part of myself, and I'd much rather know you more before I take on the role of the one who ends your life." This time, Haku squinted and coughed multiple times before yelling at him. "We're nothing alike. I failed my precious person. I'm a useless tool for Zabuza-sama to wield. I was defeated, now kill me." Naruto sighed and shook his head, his face softening. For the first time, Haku took a closer look at Naruto and noticed something that resembled staring into a mirror in his deep cerulean eyes. She finally let her arms drop, bit her lower lip, and started crying as she leaned in closer to him. She was crying, but why? Was she defeated because she had lost and let Zabuza-sama down? Or was it because she discovered someone who resembled her so much that it was difficult for her to acknowledge and come to terms with it after leading such a life for so long? For longer than he had known her, Naruto waited for her to relax and release whatever it was that she appeared to be holding in. He didn't say anything until she had caught her breath. "You okay?" At his question, Haku's eyes widened, but they quickly relaxed as she laughed in spite of herself. The blonde-haired swordsman was still holding her by the wrists when she said, "I'll live." She then wiped her eyes with her shoulder. As soon as she raised her gaze to him, she began to admire certain aspects of him that she had never noticed before. The sunrise's glow on his back, which gave him a kind of radiance, allowed her to see more details as the morning's dawn approached. In her imagination, he had attractive features. She felt good when she looked into his eyes, which had an unbelievable depth for someone his age. She was enthralled with those Han blue eyes of his. They currently feel nurturing and expectant, much like her late mother's arms did when she was struggling, her mom. Haku sighed and closed her eyes, then opened them to stare at Naruto once more. "You said that you wanted to know me before you killed me, is that right?" After scowling, Naruto nodded. Although she was technically correct, he didn't like the way she phrased his point. Haku shut her eyes again. "I was born in a small village outside of Kirigakure during the bloodline purge that was going on throughout Mist Country. When I was 6, I found out that I had a bloodline when I accidentally made a small figurine out of ice. Proud of my discovery, I showed my mother, who seemed terrified that I had done what I had. She gave me a short story how we were the last of a long line of Hyouten users and that the two of us were the last of the line. My mother had fallen in love with a man, my father, who later declared that he despised those with a bloodline and considered them freaks of nature. He joined the bandwagon of the murders of Kiri, who killed anyone who had a bloodline. My mother warned me never to use this ability again, as if my father found out he would kill the both of us. Unfortunately, my mother didn't heed her own advice. She had used her ability to put out a fire in the kitchen just as my father walked through the front door. In front of my own eyes, he stabbed her repeatedly with a kitchen knife until she didn't move or speak anymore." Haku saw that Naruto looked between horrified and murderous when he heard the last part. Despite how stupid it was for him to care as a shinobi, Haku secretly grinned at the boy's concern and apparent concern. Haku closed her eyes and opened them with a lifeless expression. His sights were soon on me, as he suspected, like mother, like daughter. However, the coward that he was, he waited until he had a whole group to join him, as he soon attacked me. I killed him. Just before he could stick the knife he held into me, I used my newfound abilities and stuck an ice blade right into the base of his skull. Haku was shocked to see no response from Naruto following that revelation, as he patiently waited for her to go on. With a smile on her face, she continued to look up. I had ran out of the village and was living on the streets of Kirigakure for about a year or so after that had happened. That's where I met Zabuza-sama. At first he paid me no mind, but later, the next day, he came to me and told me that he had no desire to see me as a human but only to sharpen and mold me into the perfect weapon for him to use. He saved me from a life of nothingness. In return I helped him in his goal to bring down the Mizukage and restore the honor that he had lost when his first attempt had failed. She glanced back at Naruto to observe his eyes closed, his brow furrowed as he looked to be in an in-depth thought process. After confronting Naruto on the field, Haku turned her gaze back to the basket she had left. She still needed to return to Zabuza and alert him to Naruto's powers. His eyes slowly opened with a sorrowful expression as he let out a sigh, causing her to turn back to face him. We're more alike than you can possibly know, Haku-chan. Haku blushed a little as a result of the loving addition he made to her name, which caused her eyes to widen slightly. She looked away and stammered, "Why do you say that?" With a sigh, Naruto released one of her wrists and successfully knocked her out by hitting her in the back of the neck. With a dejected sigh, he lifted her body and carried her back to Tazuna's house, where the others had already begun to wake up. I'll tell you when all of this is over. I just hope you can forgive me if I, or my team, kill your precious person, Haku-chan. It would be an understatement to say that the other residents of Tazuna's house were shocked when Naruto returned in the early morning with a teenage girl bound to his shoulder. But Naruto gestured for them to hold off on asking questions while he ascended the stairs, put the unconscious girl in one of the guest rooms, and then left in silence, closing the paper door behind him. When he turned around, his senseis and team were staring at him curiously. Naruto, Yugo said. Why is there a girl tied up and knocked out in that room? Naruto leaned against the door and sighed. She's the hunter Enin that supposedly disposed of Zabuza. I met her a few hours ago trying to pass herself off as a civilian gathering herbs. When his team learned that Naruto had found his accomplice and that the monstrous swordsman was still alive, their eyes widened. However, neither Yugo nor Hayate appeared surprised. Hayate just laughed. His expression turned serious as he said, "You're something else, kid. You held your own against Zabuza, fairly well, and have managed to subdue his apprentice as well. However, I have to ask, why you decided to take her captive instead of killing her?" Naruto asked, "Are you asking as to what my motives were in sparing her life?" After receiving a nod from Hayate, he stood up and turned to face the door. With a weary sigh, he turned back to the nervous group. "All I can say is that she's more like me than you could possibly imagine." Following that remark, there was a relative silence, but it was abruptly broken by Yugo closing her eyes and then opening them to cautiously gaze at Naruto. "Naruto," said Yugo, "it's admirable that you decided not to take her life. However, she's still a possible threat not only to us but to our client who she and Zabuza have been contracted to be taken out by Gadu. You do realize the threat you have caused by bringing her back here alive?" Naruto replied, "I have, trust me. However, her loyalties lie only with Zabuza, not Gadu. If by some way, Zabuza could be convinced to drop this job, then the two of them would stop their pursuit of Tazuna." Sighed Naruto, "Most likely, though, I think we'll have to end his life in the end." Yugo and Hayate both nodded in agreement with Naruto's summary. But Lee didn't get it. "Forgive me, Hayate-sensei, but I don't understand. If Zabuza could be convinced to stop, why would we still need to kill him?" Tenten grumbled, "Lee, it's not that simple. He's a noob nin, a deserter, and worse, a killer with no remorse. Who knows how many he'll kill if we let him go? Yosh! It'd ruin the flames of this land if we allow him to go on with his unyouthful ways," Lee exclaimed, raising a fist as he nodded and quickly developed a sparkle in his eye. Without saying anything, Naruto turned and left his perplexed teammates with their senseis. Tenten questioned, perplexed, "What's up with Naruto?" Seeing both genins nod, Yugo sighed and said, "You remember what Naruto told you of his life and the problem he had to deal with? Well, I think Naruto, no matter how much he wants to, he can't forget the memories when he still had that problem, physically. But what does that have to do with Naruto, now? He seems saddened by this whole, we'll need to kill Zabuza, in the end, talk. What does it have to do with his past?" Lee inquired. With a sigh, Hayate said, "It's because he can relate to the girl, that's why. Remember what he told us? She's more like me than you could possibly imagine. I'm not sure as to what they have in common, but, before moving away from the wall he was leaning against and pursuing his student with blonde hair. Something happened to where Naruto felt it was necessary to spare her life. Doing even that much, it's safe to assume that Naruto has some reservations of taking the life of her master, despite the fact that he knows that's where the road will ultimately go. Naruto strolled from the house to the bridge. He knew that Lee and Tenten likely had more questions for him regarding what had happened in the woods, so he didn't really want to explain himself any more than he had already. However, he felt that he shouldn't reveal Haku's confession of her past to any of his teammates just yet, and he really didn't want to talk about it because a lot of it was discussion. But he sensed that he would soon have to. He sighed to himself, damn, can things get any more complicated? Tazuna appeared to be giving orders to some stragglers working on the bridge when Naruto soon arrived. This was impressive because Naruto didn't think the old drunk had it in him based on his behavior during their trip from Konoha. Before fog started to roll in, Naruto kept observing the bridge builder in a different light. Before Hayate heard the screams and yells coming from the area where the bridge was being constructed, he was moving at a fairly leisurely pace. He pumped charca into his legs and ran frantically in the direction of the bridge, which he instinctively knew was where Naruto had gone when he left the group at the house. His eyes widened as a certain smell hit his nose, and the sight of the bridge caused him to stop completely. The bridge was obscured by a dense, well-known fog, so it was only a partial sight. But what he could see stopped him just before he accelerated again and went toward the bridge, which was covered in the mutilated bodies of the workers. Naruto gasped as he felt another slash strike him from behind. He was still far weaker than Zabuza. The demon of the mist didn't say anything when he arrived. Instead, before Naruto could stop him from taking another life, he slashed through almost every employee on the bridge. Several cage buncheons had been forced by the blonde genin to transport Zabuza, the injured, and the survivors back to the village for medical treatment. Another was sent to notify his teammates of the attack. Before Naruto could be there to save them, the innocent men and women who were assisting Tazuna in making this bridge a reality fell victim to Zabuza's icy, grisly blade. This made Naruto feel bad. But Iruka-sensei's first lesson at the academy was, as a ninja, you'll see many deaths of people who shouldn't have died. Death is inevitable, but as a Konoha shinobi, you will be able to save some of them. As Naruto deflected another stab from Zabuza, he reflected that death is inevitable in this line of work. However, save as many as you can, including yourself, and then grieve alongside everyone. You must kill Zabuza because you are currently fighting to protect life itself from death's hands. As Zabuza relentlessly attacked him with blows, Naruto cringed physically and grimaced mentally. Naruto was shocked by the extreme stigma this man carried in his heavily bandaged body, considering that he had been literally beaten to within an inch of his life. Zabuza yelled, "Better pay attention, Baka," as he swung Kabikiri Hucho within inches of Naruto's bare left shoulder. When Naruto saw his sensei's body with his katana deflecting Zabuza's Zanpakuto, his eyes changed. But even with his sensei now present, Naruto persisted in trying to attack Zabuza. When they started attacking Zabuza, neither the teacher nor the students spoke to each other, and Zabuza appeared unfazed. In order to get around the wounds he was still healing from their previous encounter, Zabuza must have taken a lot of soldier and chakra pills. Even with his disabilities, he was still capable of creating the fog that hid him and made him a dangerous foe. Naruto felt he had had enough of his attacks under this heavy veil after almost an hour. Hakai no Kei's Haro. By forcing enough chakra into the jutsu, he was able to expel nearly all of the Mizu buncheons Zabuza had been using in this battle in addition to pushing away the fog, mist jutsu. The real Zabuza was about to grab Hayate's back when everything was cleared. Zabuza grunted in agony as he applied pressure to his left knee after Naruto threw several of his throwing weapons at him in a different order, causing him to stop attacking Hayate. Without wasting any more time, Naruto summoned Byakuya and Tasuki and ran headlong to Zabuza. The white and black kukri's pair he was holding firmly in his hands arched back behind him. Naruto had to almost drop to his knees to avoid Zabuza's swing of his enormous Zanpakuto overhead, which caused him to skid to a stop as soon as he got to him. Naruto attacked Zabuza's legs with one hand while using the other to regain his balance and momentum. When Suki's tip ripped through Zabuza's thigh muscle, he was able to get a break. But it was a brief triumph because Naruto's vision and hearing were distorted as Zabuza kicked out with his uninjured leg, sending him spiraling across the ground. Despite coughing violently, Naruto shakily stood up again, gasping for air. Sweat dripped from his forehead and puddled against his eyebrows before entering his eyes, obstructing his vision. Naruto's arms occasionally felt like they didn't exist, and he was sore all over. As quickly as it had started, Naruto's rest was over. Zabuza materialized behind him and struck the weary blonde in the head with his sword. With both of his blades aimed at his opponent's exposed front, Naruto's arms curved and swung horizontally, forcing his mind to focus. As he pierced Zabuza's abdominal wall and skewered the demon of the bloody mist stomach and large intestine, Naruto initially watched with anticipation and felt satisfied. It was replaced by the sudden coldness and mind-numbing pain that swept through him. As he looked, he became conscious of Zabuza's own blade piercing his collarbone, threatening to sever his arm entirely. Because of the pain, Naruto's vision began to blur, but before Zabuza could finish the crude amputation, Yugo, who had come to the scene with Tenten and Lee in tow, body-checked him. Naruto struggled to remove Escalibur, but once he succeeded, he rasped out the jutsu to heal himself. Thanked Kami and everyone else for his unexpected reprieve. He was so relieved and full of energy that he had no trouble getting back up on his feet. Yugo and the others appeared out of nowhere, so Naruto watched what was going on. Zabuza, who was clutching at his injured abdomen and appeared to be having trouble maintaining his stance against the two leaf Junins, was engaged in a fierce battle with Hayate and Yugo. After Yugo blocked Zabuza's attempt to split Naruto in two, Tenten and Lee were preoccupied with the two Mizu bunchins that Zabuza had clearly attempted to use against her. Naruto was observing both battles and debating who to help when he abruptly realized that there were onlookers on the bridge before the two fights. A familiar figure materialized beside him before he could take any action. -45 minutes prior to if Zabuza-sama is going to fight all four of them, he may still require my assistance. As she untied the last, hellish knot on the chakra-suspending rope that bound her, Haku hoped to herself. What that boy Naruto told her after he easily defeated her was the last thing she remembered when she first woke up. "We're more alike than you can possibly know, Haku-chan." Just the words and the smile he gave made Haku's face heat up. She had no idea why those words or the boy who said Tama were making her feel this way. Even so, they had a significant impact on her, which perplexed her because she knew he was the enemy, correct? She focused on her stealth to get out of the room and down the stairs that led to the exit, trying to get rid of the image of the boy who had beaten her. Sadly, she was unable to find a direct water source to make her mirrors and quickly flee. As a result, she had to use all of her skills and resources to quickly and covertly return to her master. The sounds of struggling outside the house, followed by cries and someone shouting, stopped her escape. She saw one of Naruto's senseis and his two teammates confronting a man she recognized as one of Gatu's samurai thugs, who was holding a woman captive with his sword near her throat, as she peered around the corner to the stairwell. The leaf nins appeared to be waiting for something, and a young boy was shouting at the man to let his mother go. With emotionless eyes, Haku observed. Although she was aware of their employer's identity and the dishonest ways he conducted business, death had become a recurring theme in her life ever since she killed her father. Calling herself innocent would be hypocritical. She was saddened by the scene being played out in front of her, but no matter how hard she tried to suppress her emotions, they seemed to occasionally surface again. Like every other time, she had to control her emotions to prevent herself from acting foolishly, like trying to save that woman. She had learned this long ago from Zabuza. It is absurd to feel the need to save someone who is unable to save themselves in the shinobi world. They are too numerous, and they will only make you weaker until an adversary takes advantage of you and it will be your downfall. She was able to let go of the feelings he believed had little bearing on becoming a shinobi through his instruction. Nevertheless, Zabuza bitterly referred to these as the moments of humanity, when she felt exposed and somewhat conflicted between her feelings and what she had been taught. When a purple-haired sensei clone tapped the samurai on the shoulder, causing him to turn his head away from the group, Haku was startled out of her mental self-evaluation as the scene before her changed. The man released both the woman and his weapon when the weapon's mistress in training inserted two throwing knives into his jugular. He then clutched his fatal wound, gurgling, and died bleeding out. The group swiftly departed after ensuring the safety of the woman and son, most likely to the bridge where Haku surmised Zabuza was engaged in combat with Naruto and his other sensei. She had to go there. When she noticed a running faucet in the kitchen, she discovered her escape route. She made her one-handed signals, and the exit she desired was provided by a rectangular panel of ice that served as a clear mirror. She soon found herself in the middle of nowhere, so she went back to her quick travel strategy until she reached the battleground. But when she got there, it seemed to have stopped, and she could see why when she looked around. In his oh-so glory, Gatu, the walking scab of flesh, strutted out among his samurai friends, sneering at everything around him as if it were an ant in comparison to him. Haku soon saw Zabuza, who was bleeding heavily from his abdomen and had several wounds on his arms and legs, particularly from his left knee. "Zabuza." Gato yelled. Look at you. You're not a demon at all. More like some has-been ninja. Zabuza's eyes narrowed dangerously at Gato, as Haku could see. The imp sneered even more triumphantly, seemingly unaffected. Good thing I decided not to pay you in the first place. You're a lost cause and a wasteful investment. Were we not even going to get paid? As she reflected, only a small portion of the bloodlust her master was practically pouring out of every pore of his body toward Gato, Haku thought furiously. Once more, Gato pretended that nothing was going on. Kill the men, take the women. A bonus for the one that puts the demon of the bloody mist out of his misery. The samurai displayed the same haughty grins as their boss. Just as Haku was creating a mirror to put her next to her master, she noticed that he was turning and conversing with one of the leaf nins. She was unable to hear what was being said, but as soon as it was over, she witnessed the Konoha group's male sensei toss a kunai that ended up in Zabuza's mouth. Then, like a bull on a rampage, Zabuza turned and ran directly into the samurai horde, aiming for Gato. As soon as Haku realized what her master was doing, she started preparing for the jutsu so she could accompany him and assist him. But someone stopped her. She didn't notice because as soon as she saw her loved one falling to the ground, his entire body was covered in swords and other weapons sticking out of it. Naruto was standing in Tezuna's guest bedroom doorway. Haku was inside the room, seated in a chair with his back to the window. Since Naruto had arrived 15 minutes earlier, the girl did not appear to recognize him. Naruto was conflicted about how to approach her because he had a hand in preventing her from dying with him and was partially to blame for the death of her beloved. He literally had a hand because he saw her coming and knew what she was going to try. He tried to stop her right away and held her while she watched her master, Zabuza, die after killing Gato and battling the other men he had hired. He was reluctant to approach her, though, for another reason. The words from his senseis were still echoing in his ears. On the bridge, a week prior, Haku was yelling, screaming, and crying uncontrollably as she thrashed in Naruto's grasp, never taking her eyes off the dead and defeated body of her master, her most valued loved one, Zabuza Momochi, the demon of the bloody mist. She then collapsed to her knees like a marionette whose strings had been severed, as if her mind had practically shut down. With a heavy heart, Naruto watched as she turned into a twitching, silent mess. But he focused half of his attention on Inari, Tsunami's son, and most of the people came to save his grandfather and the bridge workers. They weren't really needed, though, because Yugo, Tenten, and Lee had already destroyed the rest of Gato's horde, leaving what little was left to fight for their lives. The threat posed by Gato and Zabuza was eliminated in almost 3 hours. After years of oppression, the town responded with a great cheer that they were now free. The entire village would have been whistling a different tune, one of obedience and surrender, if Naruto and his group had not accepted the mission and flatly rejected Tezuna for deceiving them. With a sigh, the blonde genin shook his head. He shouldn't criticize them for taking so long to summon the bravery to face their oppressors. These people had every right to celebrate. While he was thinking, Naruto missed his team approaching him and his shaken person, who was still firmly grasped by her hand behind her. Naruto-kun, is she all right? She looks really bad. Yugo knelt beside the girl who was gazing into space, whispering, Zabuza-sama, several times in low tones. With a sorrowful sigh, Naruto glanced down at the girl before swinging his other arm beneath her knees, picking her up bridal style, and holding her close to him in an attempt to reassure Haku that she was okay. Her eyes were glazed over and her muttering persisted, so she did not react to this action. As his senseis appeared to be pondering, Avalon's champion noticed his teammates staring at her with sadness. The first to speak was Hayate. The once ill Junin sighed and approached his pupil. Naruto, there's something you need to know, as does Haku. Naruto had never disclosed her name, so his eyebrows shot up in surprise that his sensei had discovered it. He glanced at Haku and squeezed her to try to reassure her when he heard her abruptly stop muttering even though tears were streaming out of her eyes. While Haku appeared to tremble and gaze into space, he turned back to his senseis and nodded to them. Hayate said, well, before Zabuza took my kunai. Rewind. 20 minutes before following Gato's arrogant command to his men, Zabuza let out a dejected sigh and turned to face Hayate. Leaf Nin, I have a favor to ask. A favor? Hayate asked, raising an eyebrow. Zabuza closed his eyes and turned to face the smiling henchmen of Gato, who were slowly approaching and reaching for their swords. Use Haku well. Don't let her talents turn to rust. At first, Hayate's face twisted in perplexity, but then he realized what was going on and nodded in comprehension. Even though it seemed like he saw Hayate's response, Zabuza kept his eyes forward. Then he turned to face Hayate. Well, I'm officially not your enemy anymore. Your bridge builder's safe from me. So, got a kunai? With a sly smile, Hayate threw one to Zabuza, who caught it between his teeth as he faced the swarm of animalistic-eyed samurai approaching. With the kunai in his mouth, he said, "By the way, that blonde baka of Yursa, he's coming along fine." He didn't say anything else, and he didn't turn to face any of the other leaf nins before making his way directly to Gadu. Flashback, completed. Astonished by Zabuza's request and his casual remark about him, Naruto glanced at Haku to gauge her response. Regretfully, she continued to repeat Zabuza's name while maintaining her catatonic gaze. He sighed and turned to face his senseis, Hayate, who appeared to be waiting for a response. "You understand, Naruto, that I have no authority to grant such a request from an enemy nuke nin. It is a completely obscure request. However, I don't know Haku's past, so I cannot ultimately reject the man's last request. Should I honor his request at least until her case can be heard by the Hokage?" Naruto gave a nod. "You do realize the responsibility that comes with this, Naruto-kun?" Yugo replied. "She's your responsibility, and you know that she's not going to be happy with you when she recovers from her shock, despite whether or not you killed her master. Are you sure?" Again he nodded. "It'd be easier to run from this, but I believe she deserves a second life." He exhaled. "She may hate me for the rest of my life, but I'm not going to regret stopping her from throwing hers away." After giving a nod, Hayate went to approach the villagers and ask for their help in burying their departed friends. Yugo nodded and grinned before heading out to join Hayate. Rock Lee and Tenten came up to Naruto, with Lee yelling something about Naruto brilliant flames of youth. Tenten remarked that she agreed with Naruto's choice while ignoring her partner, who was dressed in green spandex. She then asked what kind of fighter Haku was. Haku never gave any of them a glance or acknowledged that she had heard them during this entire ordeal. Re-entering the guest bedroom after a full week, Haku had awakened from her daze, but she remained silent and aloof. Yugo informed him that she had spent some time talking to Haku, recounting to her what Hayate had said about her master's request and the fight itself, since that was all Haku was interested in. Naruto had no idea how all of this would turn out. While a part of him respected her choice to ignore him and not talk to him, another part of him truly wanted her to forgive him. Although it was only once, Yugo has been the only person to connect with her thus far. After that, Haku once again cut herself off from everyone. Naruto sighed as he watched her now and turned to walk away. "I wasn't your fault." It was barely audible above a whisper, but Naruto heard it and quickly returned to his position, responding to her a bit louder. "I'm somewhat to blame, though." Haku turned in her chair and gave him a dry red stare for the first time in more than a week. She choked on a sob, her throat probably hurting, and said, "Zabuza-sama died fighting. He had always told me that was the way he wanted to go." She closed her eyes and looked down, then took a few shaky breaths before opening them and meeting Naruto's eyes directly. Haku then slowly got up from her chair and shakily walked over to Naruto, stopping in front of him. "At first, I was furious that you denied me the right to die as Zabuza-sama's weapon. However, after speaking with your sensei, I have a little bit more of an idea as to why you did what you did, and her telling me what Zabuza-sama's last words were, well, it made me realize that I, unknowingly, would have gone against my master's wishes, had I done what intended to." She bowed deeply and closed her eyes. "Arigato, Naruto-san, for stopping me from doing something foolish." Naruto blushed and turned his head away, awkwardly scratching the side of his head. "Hey, don't worry about it. I'm just glad you're feeling better." Haku grinned and nodded. "I heard your sensei's version of what happened before I arrived. I'd very much like to hear your version as well." Naruto started telling her while grinning and nodding. The bridge was finished in a week and a half, and the survivors who had acted with Gadu had not shown any signs of retaliation during that time. During this period of relaxation, the Konoha nins received more intense training from their senseis. Lee was an exception to these exercises, which included learning how to use chakra to walk on water, sparring upside down on a branch, and learning how to defend against every type of weapon. After a prolonged period of inactivity, Haku reluctantly accepted Naruto's invitation to join their training, which left her muscles unused and her entire body rigid. Even after regaining her rhythm, she occasionally experienced emotional breakdowns. Usually, Yugo or Naruto were the ones who could support Haku during her difficult times. Despite their sympathy for Haku, Lee and Tenten were unsure of how to assist her because they still felt like total strangers to the ice user. However, Hayate believed that Naruto had a duty to support her during this time of loss. By the time the bridge was completed, it appeared that Haku had improved, and the three continued to assist the girl as much as they could. They were all aware that she was still grieving the loss of her beloved master, though. Just as Haku entered his room carrying a similar scroll containing everything she had at Zabuza's previous hideout, Naruto sealed the remaining items in his possession. Initially, Naruto intended to send a shadow clone with her to check on her and, ideally, keep her from becoming even more grieving and possibly ending her own life. She stopped short of her journey and assured the clone that she would be alright before stealthily pulling out a senbon, striking the clone in the shin, and dispelling it, as if she knew what he was thinking. Thus, Naruto turned to face her and grinned, his eyes slightly widening comically as he took in her appearance. The long-haired brunette is wearing a lily-white kimono with patterns of orchids and cranes along the bottom. The obi was crimson red, her face was lightly makeup atoned, and her hair was tied back into a bun using red-dyed senbon for disguise. Naruto thought she looked beautiful overall. With his eyes still wide and on the verge of falling, he responded intelligently, "Yuha yuha." Haku chuckled at his response. "I'm glad you approve, Naruto-san. I decided to go like this when we enter your village, as going in as a shinobi may draw unwanted attention and may prevent me from gaining an audience with your Hokage." Naruto picked up his scroll and put it in his pocket while nodding. He followed her outside to meet with his team after saying, "Yeah, I guess you're right." Following their farewells to Inari, Tazuna, Tsunami, and a few other villagers, the Konoha group +1 set out to return as quickly as possible to Konohagakure no Sato. Tenten and Lee broke out of their awkward shells and started telling Haku stories about Konoha, making up for the one meal break. After Tenten told Haku about the village's pride in having many bloodlines, Haku started to show some reluctance. However, Naruto discreetly reassured her that he would not allow anyone to treat her as breeding stock and that he would go nuclear before that happened. Naruto's assurance that the Hokage would not force her or anyone else into a position they were unwilling, if not resolute, to adopt seemed to lift her spirits. It was obvious that Haku felt secure in Naruto's presence. Even though their roles had previously been antagonistic, she felt she could trust him. She would always feel at ease with him. She was apprehensive and wary around the other members of his group. Even though Yugo-san had a pleasant aura, it would be suicide to ignore the fact that she was a professional assassin and that she was a skilled kunoichi. Despite how Naruto made her feel, she was aware that she would soon need to develop her own strength without emotionally relying on people like Zabuza and Naruto. Other emotions surfaced when she looked at Naruto, causing her to hide her makeup. The village's gates soon materialized, and in a few minutes, everyone was inside, giving Haku a clear view of the village hidden in the leaves. It was fairly roomy, and the street they were on was lively with people chatting and kids playing carefree. This was the complete opposite of how the village in the mist behaved. On closer inspection, though, Haku noticed some commonalities, such as the shinobi's continual movement on the rooftops and their glares at strangers. But this time, something was different. There were words, but they weren't whispered or barely coherent. Instead, they were loud enough to be heard. "Great. The demon brat is back alive." This comment stunned Haku. She had serious doubts that word of the person she was apprenticing at the time would spread swiftly throughout this village and turn into widespread rumors. Their eyes seemed to be focused more on Naruto, the person sitting next to her, than on her, as they burrowed in a hateful manifested glare. She turned to face her friend, but she soon found herself staggering in disbelief as she gaped at the boy's new appearance. His entire arsenal had vanished, and he was only a few inches shorter than her. His bright neon orange jumpsuit, which had white and blue accents on the pockets and cuffs, was an eyesore. There were 3 whisker-like marks on each of his cheeks, which were somewhat prominent due to the baby fat he had put on his face. To be honest, he didn't resemble a shinobi at all. Haku deliberately used her chakra senses to reach out and discovered a very thick layer of genjutsu covering his entire body, including his pores, to cover up his odor. This time, Haku leaned down and whispered into Naruto's ear, asking, "Why are you looking like that? It makes you look like an idiot." She muttered, "Told you so, Naruto," and was surprised to hear Tenten. Her rebuke made Naruto sigh, but he looked up at Haku and mouthed, "I'll tell you later inside." Haku gave them a nod and followed them the rest of the way, until they were all outside a set of enormous oak doors with a black fire symbol painted on the outside. The Hokage was in the middle of a meeting with his advisors when they arrived, but the secretary informed them that he would be available shortly. As a result, while Lee and Naruto discussed the advantages and disadvantages of employing weapons with different taijutsu stances, Tenten spoke with Haku about the use of senbon in combat. By the time the Hokage's office doors opened and the advisors quickly left, Naruto and Lee were still engaged in their argument. After confirming that the Hokage was prepared for new guests, the secretary went inside first and allowed everyone to enter. Soon after, Naruto returned to his apartment and put everything he had sealed in his scroll back in its proper place. But his thoughts were consumed by what had transpired in the Hokage's office just before they had all departed. An hour and a half earlier, from what Naruto could see, things were going rather well. Haku was welcomed into the village by the old man, who also assigned her to train with the Anbu in order to assess her abilities for a proper ranking. Haku seemed to accept Naruto's lengthy explanation for having to hide behind the mask of his former self after he dispelled the illusion surrounding himself, but he continued to call him an idiot, just like Tenten did. Despite Dazuna's deception, the Hokage appeared satisfied with the report and informed the three genin that they performed admirably. After everything was said and done, Hayate quickly became the center of attention. I think now would be a good time to announce that both Guy, Yugo, and myself have decided to nominate you three and Neji for the Chunin exams. Tenten's eyes glowed with excitement. Lee raised his fist with a loud, "Yosh!" to accompany it, and Naruto looked shocked and gave a, "Huh." Naruto's expression grew more serious as he turned to face his senseis. "What should I expect?" Hayate gave his student a mental nod of approval for not getting so swept up in the moment that he would enter blind like so many others before him. He then approached his student and put his hands on both of his shoulders while looking into his eyes. "Promise me this, if you're serious about taking this exam, then you should go in as a serious shinobi and leave your mask behind. We'll discuss that in 3 days while we allow you to get some rest. Then we'll be training you harder than ever to make sure you're ready for this. Oh, and another thing, Naruto." "What?" Naruto's eyes widened. Sighing, "Ni-chan, although it's admirable of you to keep up this farce of you still being the Jinchuriki, just to keep the mournful happy, it's time that you show everybody something they're not prepared for. I didn't get the reputation for being the most unpredictable ninja in training, just as a hand-down title. I earned that for doing the unthinkable. Besides, going in looking as what I really am won't change people's perception of me," Naruto replied. "Then what are you afraid of that you still want to hide behind an illusion?" asked Hayate. As everyone else gazed expectantly at Naruto, he turned his attention to the ground. In other words, everyone except the Hokage, Yugo, and Haku. "You still want people to accept you, isn't that right, Naruto-kun?" the Sandame said with a knowing nod and a sigh. While continuing to gaze at the ground, Naruto appeared to validate Sarutobi's observation. Lee said, looking perplexed, "But Naruto-kun, Tenten, Guy-sensei, Yugo, and Hayate-sensei, even Haku-san, we all accept you." With a sigh, Yugo dropped to her knees and touched Naruto's shoulder. As she patted his head and Naruto's side, she sadly concluded, "You're right, Lee-kun, we all accept Naruto as he is, but the council and villagers. Who cares?" Tenten asked, drawing attention to herself. "Who cares what their impressions will be after he reveals what he really looks like? What could they do? They've managed to convince the entire village save a few people that I'm a demon who would eat their children when their backs are turned, that I'm responsible for all the deaths committed by the Kyuubi, and that I'm better off either exiled or executed. If I show what I really look like, I might be looking at either being arrested or banned from the village." Naruto responded and then breathed a sigh of relief. The earth. When Tenten and Lee saw what Naruto had predicted, they were appalled. Tenten muttered, "You can't be serious, the Hokage wouldn't." After stopping her with a raised hand, the Sandame sighed and cast a sorrowful glance at the village outside the window. "It'd be nice if the title of Hokage matches the image and ideals talked about it. However, in reality, there is only so much I can do, and much half is governed by a democracy of voting in the council." Naruto has some truth about how the council might respond to his new appearance. The Hokage then let out a slight grin on his lips. "However, there have been moments where people might change for the better." Startled, Naruto raised his head from the ground to gaze at the Hokage. "But Gigi, it's been 6 years and..." This time, Hayate cut off the conversation. "Naruto, as nice as it is for the Sandame to spend so much time, it's getting late. Like I said, you need to decide whether or not you're going to do this. Nevertheless, my condition still stands. If you're ever to really rise in the ranks, you need to have faith in yourself even if others might not. Let me know in 3 days what your decision is." End flashback. As he stored the final items from his scroll, Naruto sighed. Would he be able to reveal himself? He had grown accustomed to keeping everything hidden from everyone, but that quickly changed with Lee, Tenten, Haku, and his senseis. Could he really reveal who he really was to a village full of people who believed the Kyuubi had transformed into a child in order to make fun of their hurt and rage? What would happen in the end? Naruto was unsure, but he thought sleeping on it would be the best course of action at the moment.